Hi guys. Tonight we are going to slip into a moment that might make you shiver before you even tuck in under your own blanket. Imagine yourself trudging through the mire of a battlefield camp, sometime around the year 1350. The sky is black as pitch. The moon is just a blur behind the smoke, and the air stings your cheeks until you can't quite feel them anymore. You duck through the flap of a soldier's canvas tent, and the first thing that greets you is not warmth, not comfort, but a breath of air that feels barely softer than the brutal wind outside. Cold, heavy mud clings to your boots, and the canvas walls sag inward, heavy with droplets of condensation that might as well be tiny icicles. You glance around and wonder, honestly, how anyone managed to get through a night like this without freezing to death. And here's the reality check. You probably wouldn't survive it. Not with your 21st century habits and reliance on central heating. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, leave a comment telling me where you are in the world and what time it is right now. I love to see who's drifting to sleep across the globe at the same moment. Now, dim the lights. Let's slip further into the mud and the canvas. The tent you're in is a simple, rough contraption, 4 poles lashed together. The whole thing smells like wet wool, old smoke, and sweat. No fire crackles inside. It's far too dangerous. The risk of the whole thing going up in flames is far too high. Instead, the warmth, if you can even call it that, comes from the bodies crammed shoulder to shoulder, exhaling steam into the heavy air. This is your home for the night, and though you know dawn will bring another day of marching, or fighting for now, the challenge is just surviving until the sun rises. One mainstream fact stands out here. Medieval armies rarely fought major campaigns in the depths of winter, precisely because this nightly ordeal was too difficult. Chroniclers noted that campaigns often wound down in late autumn, resuming only with the spring thaws. Yet, as you shiver here, you know that sieges, the drawn-out strangulations of castles or towns, could not be so conveniently scheduled. Armies might linger for months in hostile territory. Weather be damned. You picture frost creeping across the ground, soldiers coughing into their hands, praying their breath won't crystallize into one last gasp. Now, for a quirky tidbit. There are records of soldiers attempting to waterproof their tents with a mixture of animal fat and even, bizarrely, fermented fish oil. Imagine lying beneath a canvas that reeks of rotting herring, but repels a bit of rain. Better smelly than soaked, or so the logic went. You might laugh at the thought of the stench, but when survival is on the line, even bad smells become oddly tolerable. Still, scholars continue to debate whether these tents were issued uniformly or cobbled together by whatever soldiers could scavenge. Some historians argue that royal armies, especially those of France or England, provided standardized tents for their men, built to collapse and be carried on carts. Others suggest that only officers had such luxuries, while common infantry curled up beneath whatever tarp or cloak they could scrape together. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, shifting with wealth, leadership, and sheer luck. You lie down now, stretching onto the frozen ground, and the first thing you notice is the seep of moisture crawling into your bones. No matter how you shift, the damp earth pulls at you like a hungry ghost. The canvas above you flaps in the wind, a mournful percussion that feels like it's mocking your shivers. Sleep will not come easily tonight. Your fellow soldiers murmur in the darkness, trading curses at the weather and muttered prayers for safety. One snores already, his breath rattling like a bellows, while another pulls his cloak tighter, muttering about the foolishness of fighting in such cold. You realize that in this darkness, even the enemy seems less terrifying than the numbness creeping into your fingers. There is a curious detail you can almost taste in the air. The mingled odor of damp wool, old straw, and bodies that haven't bathed in weeks. For a moment you picture your own modern bed, the fresh sheets, the heater humming softly, and you understand why chroniclers describe tents like these as a living grave. It isn't death by sword or arrow that frightens you most here. It's the quiet possibility of simply never waking because your body could no longer keep itself warm. A rat scurries past your hand, bold as you are still. Vermin thrived in these camps, feeding off scraps and crawling into bedding to steal crumbs or warmth. One soldier swats at it lazily, too tired to care, too weary to chase it off. The little creature disappears into the shadows, reminding you that life in camp is a hierarchy of endurance, from rats to men. Your thoughts wander to the officers' tents, somewhere nearby. Bigger, heavier pavilions propped up with ropes and poles, sometimes even lined with rugs stolen from wealthy houses. You resent the thought of them sipping warm wine while you huddle here in the dark. Yet, even for them, comfort was relative. Many still woke to frozen beards and stiff joints, their finery doing little against the clawing cold of medieval nights. As the hours pass, you hear the canvas strain under the weight of frost, the tiny pops of ice forming on the seams. Your back aches, your toes throb, and you realize why so many soldiers wrote songs, whispered jokes, or sang boisterously at night. Distraction was sometimes the only blanket they had. You hum softly to yourself, the tune trembling in your chest, and you sense the others listening, grateful for anything that might keep them awake just a little longer before the plunge into uneasy dreams. And so you close your eyes in that tent, feeling the rough canvas walls sagging, hearing the night crack with frost outside, smelling the blend of wool, smoke, and humanity. You know you'll wake to another day, if you wake at all. With ice crusting your lashes and the march calling you onward, the tent does not promise safety, but it is the only barrier between you and the elements. You wake with a stiff groan, but instead of leaving the cold behind, you discover the chill has crept into your bones like an unwelcome tenant. The canvas above your head is slick with condensation, dripping faintly onto your cheek, and you swipe it away, only to smear mud into your beard. It's still night outside, judging by the hush. The stars remain smothered behind a blanket of fog, and you roll onto your side, fumbling with the wool cloak that is your one true ally against this gnawing freeze. Wool. It is scratchy, coarse, often pungent from lanolin and sweat, but this is the miracle material of medieval survival. You feel its weight pressing down, not soft and comforting like your modern fleece blanket, but stubborn, rough, and incredibly heavy. Soldiers prized it because, even when wet, it could hold warmth, trapping essential pockets of air close to the skin. That's the mainstream fact you notice in the dimness. Cloaks, tunics, and even tent walls stitched from wool gave medieval armies their best chance of enduring these icy nights. Chronicles of the 100 Years' War describe men layering cloaks upon cloaks, wrapping their legs in strips of the fabric, and sometimes even using the garments as extra padding beneath them on the frozen ground. Of course, there were quirks, too. Did you know that some troops, desperate for insulation, lined their wool with horsehair? You picture it, half cloak, half mane, a garment that smelled powerfully like stable muck, but supposedly trapped an extra layer of air. Not exactly high fashion, but when your choices are freezing or looking ridiculous, well, pride has a way of bowing to survival. Imagine strutting into camp, wrapped in what looks like an unshaven pony. Yet, everyone envies your warmth. Scholars remain divided on just how effective these layers were when compared with furs or hides. Some argue that wool provided unmatched resilience in damp weather. Others insist fur held more heat. There's still no clear consensus, and you can practically hear the voices of historians debating over their cups of coffee, or maybe mulled wine, while you lie here in your cloak that feels both miraculous and maddening. The itch of the fibers against your neck is constant, like being nibbled by invisible ants. You tug the cloak higher, fold it beneath your head, and realize that medieval soldiers often had to repurpose garments for tasks they were never designed to do. Cloaks doubled as bedding, as makeshift pillows, sometimes even as stretchers when carrying the wounded. Tonight, yours is all of the above. Mattress, blanket, and shield against the draught, slinking through the cracks of the tent. As you lie still, you notice how the men around you shift and grumble in their own nests of wool. One man mutters about his toes, another about the ache in his back. A third has his cloak pulled so tightly around him he looks like a giant cocoon, his breath puffing steadily into the folds. The sound is oddly comforting, like a chorus of moths tucked into cocoons. You realize that warmth was not just about material, but also about morale. knowing that everyone else is enduring the same itch, the same smell, the same scratchy embrace of wool. You take a slow breath and inhale the peculiar cocktail of scents that come with wool cloaks: damp lanolin, smoke from last night's campfire, a lingering note of wet dog. Not romantic, perhaps, but grounding. These are the smells that tether you to the reality of camp life. Modern people rave about scented candles and diffusers. Here, your diffuser is a soldier who hasn't washed in a month. There's another curious thought that flits through your tired mind: the color of your cloak. For common soldiers, wool cloaks were rarely dyed. Natural browns and greys were the default. Though officers might sport brighter shades, dyed with madder root or woad, those dyes were not just vanity. They helped keep rank visible, even at night. You can imagine peering across a dark tent and spotting a flash of red, knowing it belonged to a captain or knight, while you huddle in your humble grey cocoon. The debate continues in your thoughts. How much of this wool was issued, and how much was brought from home? Some accounts hint at armies supplying cloaks as part of a soldier's kit, but others suggest that men brought whatever they could afford. If you were poor, your cloak might be a family hand-me-down, patched with leather, moth-eaten, but still clinging to usefulness. If you were wealthy, perhaps your cloak was lined with fur, stitched by a skilled hand, and the envy of your comrades. The contrast reminds you that even in survival, social rank pressed heavily on the cold. You pull the wool tighter and roll onto your side, trying to imagine the mental tricks soldiers played to endure, perhaps some counted breaths, focusing on the rhythm of inhale and exhale. Others might whisper verses or prayers, steadying their minds against the relentless gnaw of the cold. And you, lying here centuries later in your imagination, find yourself muttering that you'd trade 1,000 cloaks for one radiator. Yet you drift in and out of shallow dozes, waking each time your body twitches with cold. The wool cloak scratches your chin as you turn, the damp creeping steadily into the fabric. But still it does its job. You are not warm, but you are not frozen. You hover in that delicate balance between misery and survival. And somehow, you understand why generations of soldiers swore by wool as their most faithful companion. When at last the faintest light creeps through the canvas seams, you tug the cloak over your head to shield your eyes. Morning frost will be waiting, and so will the march. But for now, for just one last stolen moment, you burrow into the itchy embrace of wool and pretend you might sleep a little longer. You are still wrapped in your stubborn wool, but the tent now feels smaller, tighter, as if the canvas itself has drawn closer overnight. In truth, nothing has shrunk. Nothing except the distance between you and the men packed tightly around you. That is the other great secret of medieval survival: body heat, the human furnace. Inefficient when alone, but strangely, powerfully effective when multiplied. You find yourself wedged between two other soldiers, shoulders touching, knees colliding, all of you a tangle of limbs, cloaks, and muttered complaints. This is not a matter of preference. It is pure necessity. You may joke about personal space in your modern life, but here in the camp, huddling is the critical difference between waking stiff and waking dead. Soldiers knew this instinctively. You crowded together, you shared warmth, and you endured. Chroniclers describe ranks of men sleeping like stacked logs, bodies pressed so closely that when one man shifted, the entire row shifted with him. That's the mainstream fact tonight. Survival, it seems, often depended less on equipment and more on companionship. And yet, there are strange, almost comic footnotes to this practice. A quirky tidbit survives in anecdotes. Sometimes soldiers would deliberately sleep in alternating directions, so their heads and feet interlocked like crooked puzzle pieces. The reason? To avoid the endless complaints about bad breath. You laugh quietly in your corner of the tent, imagining rows of stinking, muddy boots at face level. Perhaps not much of an improvement, but at least no one was snoring directly into your ear. Historians are not entirely agreed on how common this arrangement was. Some argue that descriptions of men sleeping like fish in a barrel were metaphorical exaggerations, not literal rows. Others insist archaeological evidence of long communal pits, still bearing traces of bedding, suggests it really did happen. The debate lingers unresolved. But you don't need a dissertation. You only need to feel the weight of another man's elbow digging sharply into your ribs to know that closeness was inescapable. As the night deepens, you notice how the warmth spreads unevenly. The men in the middle where you happen to be are almost sweltering compared to those on the edges. You can feel a bead of sweat beneath your cloak, while the poor souls near the drafty canvas mutter curses about frozen ears. This is the strange democracy of cold. Someone will always pay the higher price. And yet, no one volunteers for the edge unless commanded. The middle spots are coveted real estate, sometimes reserved for veterans or favorites. You wonder idly whether soldiers ever bribed their way inward with a promise of bread or a sip of wine. The air grows heavy, thick with the sound of shared breathing. Dozens of lungs pumping together create a rhythm that is almost hypnotic. You find yourself swaying in time, lulled by the collective exhalations. But the smell, the smell reminds you that intimacy comes with a tax. Wool, smoke, unwashed flesh, and the sour tang of wine stew together in this confined bubble. You wrinkle your nose, but you accept it. After all, this odor is proof that the tent is full, that you are not alone, and that your collective heat may just see you through until morning. There is a curious moment when you shift, and your hand brushes the shoulder of the soldier next to you. He doesn't flinch. In fact, he leans a little closer, murmuring some half prayer, half lament. This intimacy is not about friendship or comfort. It is about survival. The tent strips away all modesty and privacy, leaving only raw necessity. You imagine yourself back home, explaining to friends that the only thing between you and hypothermia was the shoulder of a man you barely knew. They would laugh. Here, no one laughs. Here, no one survives alone. Another soldier mutters in his sleep, jerks upright, then settles again, disturbing the delicate balance of the row. A ripple travels down the line as men adjust cloaks and positions. You sigh, realizing that even sleep is communal, negotiated moment by moment. Rest is fragile in this world, constantly interrupted by coughs, snores, or the restless shiver of someone fighting back the cold. You notice that some of the men clutch their weapons even in slumber, swords or spears pressed against their sides, daggers beneath cloaks. Perhaps it is habit, or fear, or simply that the weapons make convenient bedfellows when there is no space left. Yet this, too, adds warmth. The cold steel pressed against a leg absorbs some heat, though not without its own risk. More than one tale survives of men waking with a burn-like chill mark from metal left too long against their skin. The hours drag. You drift into shallow dreams where you march endlessly but never grow warm. Each time you stir, you are reminded of the closeness of others, their heat, their weight, their uninvited intimacy. Yet strangely, this becomes a comfort. The cold gnaws less fiercely when you are part of the pack. You feel it in your bones. Humanity has always survived by huddling. Even in Stone Age caves, people pressed together by firelight. Here, the tradition continues beneath sagging canvas. A rat scuttles overhead, its claws scratching faintly against the canvas. No one moves. The heat is too precious to break, and you all remain in your row, listening. It is a strange thing to realize that the rodent has more freedom than you do. It can scamper into the night while you lie pinned by necessity. You close your eyes again, pushing past the itch of wool, the rank of sweat, the chorus of snores. Instead, you focus on the warmth. Steady, communal, undeniable. You are not comfortable, but you are alive. And for a soldier in a medieval tent, that was sometimes the greatest triumph of all. The ground beneath you feels harder with every passing hour, as if the earth itself is intent on swallowing what little heat remains in your body. It is then that you realize why soldiers prize straw as dearly as they did. The cold does not just come from the air. It seeps up from the ground, creeping through your boots, through your cloak, and into your very bones. To fight that invisible thief, armies spread layers of straw beneath their bedding, creating a fragile cushion between flesh and frozen soil. This was no luxury. This was a mainstream fact of medieval campaigns. Chronicles of sieges from France to the Holy Land mention soldiers foraging for straw, not only to feed animals, but also to keep themselves alive. A thick layer could transform the worst tent into something almost tolerable. though by tolerable, you mean merely less agonizing than bare earth. You stretch out now, your cloak scratching your chin, but beneath your back you feel the faint crunch of straw. Brittle stalks press into you like 1,000 tiny quills. It's not comfortable, but it is essential. And of course, the practice gave rise to quirks. One odd tidbit: some soldiers swore by stuffing their boots with straw overnight, claiming it kept their toes from freezing off. Imagine pulling on your boots in the morning, only to find them bursting with dry stalks, sticking out between seams like tufts of hair. You picture men marching away with little golden whiskers sprouting from their heels, and you can't help but smile through the discomfort. Practical? Yes. Stylish? Not in the least. Still, scholars are uncertain whether all armies relied on straw bedding, or only those who could spare the resource. Was it standard issue, carted along in wagons, or scavenged from nearby villages at the cost of angry farmers? Some argue that well-supplied forces, like the French crown, distributed it regularly, while others suggest common infantry had to scrounge whatever they could steal. The historical record remains fuzzy, and in that uncertainty lies the image of you crawling out into the dark to beg, borrow, or pilfer enough straw just to make it through the night. You shift, and the straw crackles beneath you, releasing a faint, sweet smell that carries memories of fields in warmer months. The irony is cruel. You smell summer even as your fingers ache with cold. Yet that scent is a comfort, a reminder that life persists beyond this frozen misery. For a brief moment, you pretend you are lying in a barn rather than a battlefield, that your enemies are just shadows rather than men sharpening swords in the distance. The sound of shifting straw fills the tent as others adjust their bedding. It rustles like whispers, a chorus of dry stalks. One soldier curses as the straw pricks through his cloak. Another laughs quietly, saying it feels like sleeping on porcupines. And still, despite the jokes, no one discards it, because without it, the earth itself will steal their warmth, and there is no bargaining with frozen soil. Some men grow restless, tugging their cloaks tighter and complaining that the straw has grown damp, and there lies the flaw. Straw is only as good as it is dry. Once soaked with rain or snowmelt, it becomes a sponge, sapping heat faster than bare ground. You imagine waking in a puddle of mush, your straw mattress transformed into a freezing swamp, and suddenly you understand why soldiers guarded their bedding like treasure. Dry straw was a currency of survival. Hoarded, traded, even stolen. Your eyes wander to the seams of the tent where frost has crept down like lace. The straw muffles the ground's bite, but the air still nips cruelly at your nose. You curl tighter, drawing your cloak around you, feeling the stalks crunch beneath your hips. They dig into you in uneven lumps, some sharp, some soft, but you decide you'd rather endure a few scratches than the icy embrace of earth. One soldier near you mutters that he once saw men in Spain weaving mats from straw, rolling them up like primitive sleeping bags. Another scoffs, saying, mats would never survive a damp northern winter. And just like that, the campfire debates of scholars echo in your ears through the voices of weary soldiers. What works in one climate may fail in another. It's a timeless argument, ingenuity versus environment. And so in this tent, you resign yourself to the prickling, itchy mattress beneath you. You let the straw scratch your skin and rattle in your ears, because those brittle stalks are all that stand between you and the grasp of frozen earth. You close your eyes, whispering, thanks to a farmer you'll never meet, whose harvest leftovers became your salvation. And with that, you drift into another uneasy slumber, cushioned not by luxury, but by the stubborn resilience of straw. You stir awake again, this time coughing at the acrid tang that sneaks under the tent flap. The smoke is sharp and biting, curling into your throat until your eyes water. For a moment, you panic, thinking the tent has caught fire. But then you remember, the flames are just outside, set deliberately at the entrance. It's a small blaze, shielded by stones or a shallow pit, meant to throw heat inward while keeping the worst of the sparks out. This is a balancing act, one that medieval armies knew all too well. Fire brought warmth, but fire also brought risk. Chronicles of winter campaigns note more than one disaster where a careless ember transformed canvas camps into blazing infernos. That's your mainstream fact here. Tents and fire lived in an uneasy partnership. Each soldier was constantly weighing comfort against catastrophe. You picture the scene. Flames licking at the air, soldiers crouched near the opening, their faces glowing red while their backs remain frozen in shadow. It is survival by compromise. A smoky gamble played every single night. And yet, quirks abounded. There are accounts of men burying smouldering logs just beneath the surface of the soil inside their tents, hoping the gentle warmth would rise through the earth. Imagine it. You lie down on what feels like a heated floor, smugly warm, only to wake, to smoke choking your lungs, or worse, your cloak smouldering at the edges. Not exactly the sort of camp innovation that won awards, but desperation breeds odd solutions, and some of them worked, at least long enough to inspire others to try. Still, historians debate whether these fires were common practice or rare exceptions. Some argue the dangers were so obvious that soldiers mostly avoided bringing flame near canvas at all. Others counter that without fire, freezing nights would have culled armies too quickly, so the risk was simply unavoidable. The truth likely varied, depending on supplies, climate, and the level of discipline among the troops. One commander might ban fires outright, while another turned a blind eye. As long as his men could still march come dawn. You crawl closer to the tent flap, peering at the blaze outside. Sparks jump upward into the dark sky, tiny stars against the void. The heat brushes your face, warm enough to make you sigh with relief, but it's not strong enough to reach your feet. You notice how the men nearest the opening dominate the warmth. Their boots stretch toward the fire, their laughter louder than the hiss of wood. Those farther back shift restlessly, wrapped tight in cloaks, muttering about the unfairness of it all. Even here, fire creates hierarchy. Your throat scratches from the smoke, and you can almost taste the bitter resin of half-burned pine. It clings to your tongue, invades your nostrils, leaves you blinking. You realize that every soldier in this camp will wake tomorrow with eyes rimmed red, coughing as though ill. Yet still, no one abandons the fire. Discomfort is preferable to frostbite. One man near you tells a story of a camp in Burgundy where the commander's pavilion went up in flames, consuming precious maps and banners. Another interrupts with a joke about roasted sausages and commanders who finally cooked for their men. The laughter ripples through the group, a fragile defense against fear, because deep down, every soldier knows he is sleeping in a tinderbox. The fire itself becomes a kind of ritual. Men gather around it before bedding down, warming hands, sharing news, singing crude verses. Then, when the flames shrink, they retreat into their tents, carrying the fading memory of warmth like a talisman. You picture it now. Dozens of little fires scattered across the camp, glowing like embers in a vast field of darkness. From above, the army would look like a constellation laid across the earth. As you pull back into the tent, the air grows colder again, the warmth replaced by the damp chill of breath and canvas. The smell of smoke lingers in your cloak, clinging like perfume, a scent both comforting and suffocating. You cough once more, then lie back down on your prickly straw, aware that every soldier here has made the same silent calculation. Better to risk fire than to die quietly of cold. The crackle outside fades to a soft hiss, the fire shrinking as wood turns to ash. You close your eyes, imagining the last sparks glowing red, then grey, then gone. And in that fading warmth, you feel both grateful and uneasy, knowing the fire is both savior and executioner, friend and enemy. The fire at the entrance has dwindled to ash, leaving behind nothing but smoke that clings to your cloak. You cough softly, roll to one side, and notice a faint red glow, this one deeper inside the tent. At first, you think your eyes are playing tricks, but then you catch the dull shine of coals in a shallow metal pan, a brazier, small, portable, and glowing like a heart in the darkness. This is the soldier's other trick against the night. Braziers, filled with charcoal or wood embers, were carried into tents for just enough warmth to ward off death. This isn't enough to make things cozy, but it is enough to take the lethal edge off the frost. That's the mainstream fact here. Portable braziers were common in both noble pavilions and, when supplies allowed, the humbler quarters of the rank and file. They were part of camp life across Europe, mentioned in chronicles, painted in manuscripts, and unearthed in soot-stained fragments by archaeologists. You edge closer to the faint glow, letting the warmth touch your knees. It's a pitiful heat compared to a roaring hearth, but when you've been shivering for hours, even the smallest ember feels like heaven. The brazier radiates in silence, glowing red at its heart, ringed with grey ash. You hold your hands above it, wiggling your fingers, and smile faintly as the stiffness recedes. It is the kind of relief that almost makes you forget how fragile the setup is. Because here's the quirky tidbit. Medieval soldiers sometimes cooked over these very same braziers, filling the tent with the scent of stew or sizzling fat. Imagine trying to sleep while your comrade fries a strip of bacon on a metal pan barely a foot away from your head. You roll your eyes in the dark, because you know what comes next. Half the tent awake, salivating, muttering curses about greedy stomachs. Yet, for all the annoyance, food and fire blurred into one another. The brazier doubled as kitchen and heater survival in a shallow iron bowl. Still, there's a heated scholarly debate over whether soldiers actually kept braziers inside the cramped tents of the common ranks. Some historians argue that fire inside was far too dangerous, citing the ever-present risk of suffocation from smoke or outright immolation. Others point to surviving accounts of glowing pans in the quarters of not only nobles but also ordinary men. The truth, as always, is likely messy. Some camps banned it, others tolerated it, and many soldiers simply took the risk when frost made the choice between danger and death too clear to ignore. You close your eyes for a moment, letting your other senses wander. The smell hits you first, a mixture of charred wood and a faint iron tang, that metallic scent of heated steel. It mixes with the wool, the damp canvas, and the ever-present musk of unwashed bodies. Yet the brazier adds something more, a memory of home, perhaps of kitchens and hearths and bread baked on coals. You think of the men around you, and how many must have stared into such glows, thinking of wives, children, or simply a roof that didn't flap in the wind. The brazier does its job well enough, but it also has its flaws. The heat is fickle, rising straight upward in a narrow column. Your toes remain frozen even as your palms grow pink. You wiggle your legs closer, then curse as another soldier shoves you back, claiming the better spot. In cramped quarters, even this meager warmth becomes a contested resource. There are no polite turns. There is only shoving, muttering, and sometimes outright fights over who gets the glowing prize for the night. Another soldier, older and more cynical, points out the cost. Charcoal, or wood, is finite. It's carted across miles, fought over in villages, rationed out in handfuls. Braziers cannot burn without fuel, and fuel does not last forever. So the glow you admire is a luxury, not a guarantee. You watch the coals dim a little and realize how fleeting this comfort is, how quickly it can vanish into grey ash. You lean closer anyway, greedily soaking in what little heat you can. The glow reflects in your eyes, flickering like candlelight. You think of how soldiers in manuscripts are sometimes drawn with a brazier between them, leaning in like moths to a flame. It is not a symbol of leisure, but of survival. These glowing pans are the heartbeat of a frozen camp, fragile and fleeting, but deeply cherished. There is a curious story, one man mutters, as he shifts nearer the coals. He says he once saw soldiers in Italy fill a brazier not with wood, but with dried dung, claiming it burned longer and with less smoke. The tent erupts in laughter, half mocking, half skeptical. But you pause, wondering, dried dung? Possibly true. Farmers used it for centuries as fuel. So why not soldiers too? You wrinkle your nose at the thought of the smell. Yet you also know survival rarely smells pleasant. As you sit there staring at the glowing bowl, you can feel sleep tugging at your eyelids. The warmth is hypnotic, lulling you into a daze. Your head droops, then jerks upright again, the old rhythm of exhaustion. Yet in this trance, you imagine the brazier as something more. A miniature sun captured in iron, guarded against the darkness. Outside, the winter wind howls. Inside, this fragile star holds back the night just enough for you to survive. One soldier coughs suddenly, waving his hand at the smoke that curls faintly upward. Another mutters about headaches, about suffocation. And yes, the danger is real. Too many braziers, too little ventilation, and the tent becomes a coffin. You realize that each ember, each flicker of light, is a gamble, a silent dice roll between warmth and poison. And yet, who among you would choose the cold certainty of frostbite over the chance of comfort? The glow fades slowly as the night wears on. The heat wanes, the ashes pile higher, and the once vivid coals collapse into themselves. You stretch your hands one last time, knowing the warmth will not last. Then you pull your cloak around you and retreat into the itchy embrace of wool and straw. The brazier has given you just enough strength to endure another hour, another dream, another dawn. As you drift towards sleep, you wonder whether the embers will last until morning or whether they will vanish into cold dust before your next breath. You do not know. But for now, the glow lingers on your eyelids, painting the dark with red. And in that fragile illusion, you allow yourself to believe you might make it through the night. You dream of warmth, of hearths blazing in stone cottages, of fresh bread baking over crackling logs. But when you wake, the fantasy shatters instantly against the cold reality of the tent. The brazier has gone cold. Your cloak is damp with breath and frost. Your toes ache as though they've turned to brittle twigs. You roll over, and something soft brushes against your cheek. It isn't the scratch of wool or the prick of straw. It's fur, thick, pungent, and a little greasy to the touch. You realize with a start that animal skins line part of the tent wall, and more have been piled around you in a crude, desperate attempt at insulation. Here lies another cornerstone of survival: hides and furs. That's your mainstream fact tonight. Medieval armies relied on animal skins in countless forms. Cloaks made of sheepskin, blankets of deerskin, linings of rabbit or squirrel, even crude tent walls patched with tough leather. They were warm, incredibly durable, and often easier to scavenge than woven cloth. Soldiers hunted, traded, or looted for them, and when winter pressed in, furs became the most precious treasure of all. You pull one closer now, a heavy pelt from some unfortunate beast, and drape it across your shoulders. It carries the smell of the animal, still a raw, earthy musk that clings stubbornly to your nose. It isn't pleasant, but it is reassuring in a primal way. Beneath the fur, your skin prickles as the warmth returns slowly, creeping in like a cautious guest. The contrast to your scratchy wool cloak is remarkable. Wool itches, fur soothes. You sink into it with a deep sigh, even if the edges are stiff with old grease. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some soldiers wore cloaks made from wolf skins, complete with the head still attached. The dangling snout flopped comically when they moved, a grim parody of a living wolf. You imagine the sight. Rows of men wrapped in wolf hides, the heads bouncing as they marched, equal parts intimidating and absurd. Still, in the right light, you'd think an army of beasts had risen from the forest. The question, though, is whether these hides were common among all troops or reserved for the wealthy. Historians debate it constantly. Some suggest that common soldiers would have relied mostly on sheepskin, the most abundant and affordable, while fox or wolf furs were luxuries seen only on knights or commanders. Others argue that looting made such distinctions blur. When an army sacked a village or raided an estate, fur-lined cloaks could end up on the backs of anyone quick enough to grab them. The truth may be less about wealth and more about sheer opportunity. You shift again, pressing your cheek into the fur. It is coarse in some places, softer in others, and it radiates a kind of heat that seems more alive than cloth ever could. You remember that people in colder climates even lined their boots with rabbit fur, tucking it into shoes for insulation. Some wrapped fur around their wrists to stop blood from freezing in their hands. You flex your fingers, imagining the relief. Small tricks, but life-saving ones. The tent is quieter tonight. Furs dampen sound as well as cold. The howling wind outside feels muted, less threatening, as though the hides themselves are guardians against the storm. You listen to the steady breathing of the men around you, most still bundled in cloaks, some lucky enough to share the animal skins. The air smells heavier, musky, oily, with a faint undercurrent of smoke. Less sharp than the wool, but deeper, more grounding. One soldier chuckles softly, telling a story of a comrade who once tried to tan his own hide in camp with improvised methods. Salt, ash, and brute determination. The result, he says, was a stiff, rancid mess that cracked like parchment and stank, so foul no one would sleep near him. You laugh along in the darkness, grateful that the hides around you, while pungent, are at least functional. There's another debate among scholars you think about while you lie there half asleep. Were hides used more for lining tents or for clothing? Archaeological evidence shows leather scraps mixed into camp debris, but it's unclear whether they came from garments, animal tack, or makeshift insulation. Some argue hides were essential to tent walls in northern campaigns, while others say soldiers mostly wore them. The absence of clear proof leaves you to imagine both. Tents patched like patchwork quilts, men huddled beneath cloaks, still marked with hooves and tails. You run your hand across the fur again, tracing the direction of the hair. It is strangely soothing, like stroking a live animal. You feel a pang of gratitude toward the beast, even if you'll never know its name or form. It is long dead, yet it guards your life tonight. You realize this is survival in its most primal bargain, humans borrowing warmth from the creatures they've killed, hoping to endure one more night in return. The fire outside has died down entirely now, leaving only the memory of its glow. Inside, the hides do their quiet work. Your body eases into something close to relaxation, and for the first time in nights, you don't shiver as violently. You close your eyes and imagine the warmth of a bear's den, a wolf's lair, a rabbit's burrow. For a moment, you are not a soldier at war, but an animal among animals, seeking only shelter from the cold. Your breath fogs the air, condensing on the fur so that tiny droplets bead on the tips of the hair. You marvel at how the hide continues to protect you even in death, shrugging off moisture while trapping heat. It is not glamorous, it is not clean, but it is effective. And in this world, effectiveness is the only beauty that matters. The night stretches on, but you do not resent it as much. Wrapped in wool, straw beneath you, fur across your chest, you feel as close to comfort as a medieval soldier can hope to get. You whisper a thank you to the nameless animal, to the farmer who bred it, to the hunter who killed it, to fate itself for dropping it into your lap. Then you let yourself slip into the fragile warmth, trusting that the fur will keep death's fingers away just a little longer. Your body jerks awake with a stab of pain that feels oddly distant, almost like a dream. You stretch your legs and realize with a familiar dismay that your boots are still on. Of course they are. You never took them off last night. You couldn't risk it. In this penetrating cold, pulling off your boots means gambling with your toes, and losing that bet is permanent. That's the blunt, mainstream fact. Medieval soldiers often slept with their boots on to protect themselves from frostbite. In an age before insulated footwear, when leather hardened stiff as boards in the night, removing boots was not only inconvenient, it was dangerously foolish. Soldiers sometimes tied strips of cloth, known as foot wraps, around their feet under the boots, but even those froze stiff when wet. So the boots stayed on, muddy, stinking, uncomfortable. They became as much part of the bed as the cloak itself. You shift and wince. The pressure of hard leather against your swollen feet is unbearable. Yet, the alternative is worse. One soldier beside you groans, muttering that his toes are numb. Another just wiggles his boots in the straw, as if to remind himself his feet are still attached. In the dark, you picture the quiet horror of frostbite. Blackened flesh, toes crumbling away. You know exactly why no one here dares to bare their feet. Then comes a quirky tidbit. Soldiers sometimes stuffed grass or even moss inside their boots at night. This wasn't for comfort, but for insulation. You can almost feel it now, the dry crunch of moss under your toes, the faint, earthy smell wafting upward. Some swore it worked better than socks, trapping precious warm air. Others laughed, saying it just turned to a frozen sludge in the morning. Still, you'd probably try it too, desperate as you are to hold on to every single toe. But historians argue endlessly about whether sleeping in boots was truly universal. Some accounts hint at men removing footwear to dry them near fires, risking their feet for the sake of soft leather in the morning. Others suggest that officers, with their larger tents and better heating, could afford the luxury of bare feet at night. It's still unclear, and you can hear the debate echoing across the centuries. Comfort versus survival. Convenience versus safety. You wiggle your toes inside the stiff boots, and the sensation is faint, barely there. panic flickers. You stamp them hard against the straw until the blood rushes back with stabbing needles of pain. You grit your teeth and curse under your breath. The man next to you does the same, stomping and groaning. The tent fills with the quiet symphony of men coaxing blood back into their frozen feet. It sounds absurd, like a chorus of angry drummers. But in truth, it is just the nightly ritual of survival. The smell of the boots, however, is impossible to ignore. Leather soaked in sweat and mud, never cleaned, festering with the sour tang of rot. You wrinkle your nose, but the others seem unfazed. After weeks in this camp, the odor becomes background noise, just another layer in the foul stew of wool, smoke, and bodies. You think of your own shoes back home fresh, clean, changed daily, and realize that here, footwear is a second skin. You notice, too, how the boots stiffen in the cold. Some men wake to find their laces frozen solid, the leather so rigid it barely bends. They curse and bang their boots against rocks or each other's backs just to soften them. Others sleep with their feet tucked close to another body, using human warmth to keep the leather pliable. You wonder how many boots cracked outright, splitting seams in the night, leaving soldiers to march barefoot through snow. The thought makes you shudder harder than the wind outside. Your hand drifts to the straps along your boots, feeling the rough stitching, the hardened seams. You picture the long march ahead. Mud sucking at the soles, snow filling the gaps, frost gnawing at every step. No wonder soldiers clung to them. Even in sleep, boots weren't just shoes. They were lifelines. Lose them, and you might as well dig your own grave. Another soldier mutters a story about a campaign in Flanders where men boiled their leather boots in water, softening them enough to eat. The tent erupts in half-hearted laughter, though you can't tell if it's really a joke. Hunger and cold make monsters of men, and suddenly you can't help but stare at your boots, wondering just how edible they'd be if things grew desperate enough. The debate returns in your mind. Were boots more valuable than cloaks, more precious than swords? Some chroniclers hinted as much, describing entire units crippled when footwear failed. You realize that while swords win battles, boots win survival. Without them, you don't march, you don't fight, you don't live. That's why you keep them on. Even in your sleep, even if your feet swell and ache, you draw your cloak tighter, curl on your side, and pull your knees up toward your chest. The boots creak against the straw, stiff but unyielding. You try to ignore the pinch at your ankles, the throb in your toes, the stink in your nostrils. Instead, you focus on the knowledge that your feet are still there, still yours, still warm enough to march tomorrow. It is a small victory, but in a frozen camp, small victories are the only kind you get. As you close your eyes again, you hear the low hum of men shifting, groaning, stamping. You imagine the sound rolling across the camp, 1,000 boots thudding faintly against straw, as though the army itself is beating a drum against the cold. A rhythm of survival, played not by musicians, but by men desperate to keep their blood moving. And in that muffled percussion, you find a strange comfort. You are not alone. Every soldier here endures the same pain, the same numb toes, the same foul smell. Together you stamp and groan and curse and endure. And somehow, in the dark, that togetherness is enough. You curl tighter, boots pressed to your chest. But sleep is shallow and uneasy. A sudden rattle of steel jerks you awake. For a moment you think the enemy has breached the camp, but no, it is only the man beside you shifting in his armor. You squint at him through the dim glow of dying embers and realize he has chosen to sleep in full gear. Breastplate, pauldrons, gauntlets, all clanking as he tries to find a position that doesn't grind metal into bone. Here's the mainstream fact. Soldiers debated endlessly whether to sleep in armor. Chronicles from the 100 Years' War, and even earlier, show both practices. Some men wore at least part of their armor at night, convinced that being surprised by an attack meant death if they weren't ready. Others stripped it off, fearing that the circulation cut off by heavy steel would leave them half paralyzed by morning. It was a nightly gamble. Security versus survival. You listen to him grunt, the plates groaning with every movement. He's not comfortable, that much is clear. Yet he insists. He mutters about a raid last winter, when men were caught unarmored and slaughtered in their sleep. The fear lingers in his voice, and you understand. Better to wake stiff and bruised than not wake at all. Then comes the quirky tidbit. Some soldiers compromised by sleeping only in their chainmail shirts, their hauberks. They claimed the interlocked rings gave warmth as well as protection. Imagine it, clinking into your bedroll, sounding like a bag of coins being shaken. One man in the corner chuckles about how he once woke entangled in his mail, unable to roll over without help. The tent erupts in quiet laughter, the sound muffled by wool and fur, because even in misery, comedy sneaks in. But historians still wrangle over the practicality. Did rank-and-file infantry really bother? Some argue that only knights and officers, those who had more to lose, slept in armor. Others suggest that everyone, even the humblest archer, sometimes kept steel close, if not worn outright. The archaeological record is silent on what was worn in bed. So the debate continues in warm lecture halls while you lie here, listening to steel scrape straw. The man in armor shifts again, muttering curses. You can almost feel the weight pressing down on him. Armor was no light costume. It could weigh 30, 40, even 50 pounds, depending on the period. To wear that all day in battle was punishing enough. To sleep in it was almost masochistic. And yet he clings to the habit, fear whispering louder than comfort. You touch your own side where your dagger rests beneath your cloak. That's your compromise. Not armor, not chainmail, but cold steel within reach. Many soldiers did the same, trusting quick reflexes more than heavy plate. Still, the thought gnaws at you. What if raiders come tonight? What if the first blow falls before you can even stand? In that moment, the man's decision to clank and suffer seems almost wise. The smell of oiled steel mingles with the musk of wool and hides. It is sharp, metallic, familiar. You close your eyes and picture rows of men, some armored, some not, all huddled in their fragile tents. The difference between them is not just strategy, but class. Officers with resources could afford to sleep armored, knowing their tents were large enough to accommodate the bulk. Poor soldiers had neither the gear nor the space. Inequality does not sleep, even in the cold. One soldier mutters that he once saw a man crushed by his own breastplate in the night, suffocated because he could not roll properly. Another scoffs, saying the tale is an exaggeration, but you can't help but shiver. To be smothered by your own protection. That is an irony too sharp to laugh at. The hours crawl. The man beside you groans again, his armor squealing as he turns. You imagine the bruises he will wake with, the red welts etched into his skin where the steel pressed too hard. Yet he seems content in his choice, murmuring prayers to saints who guard watchmen. Fear is a heavy blanket, but sometimes it warms better than wool. You think of your own life, where sleep means softness, where danger does not lurk just beyond canvas walls. Here, every choice is tainted by risk. Armor or no armor, boots or bare feet, straw or frozen ground. Nothing is simple, nothing is safe. The wind rattles the tent poles, and you jolt at the sound. Your hand tightens around your dagger instinctively. For a moment, you consider pulling your cloak aside and strapping on the breastplate lying near your feet. But you don't. Exhaustion weighs heavier than fear tonight. You let the dagger rest within reach, trusting that if death comes, you'll meet it with steel in hand, not steel on chest. The man beside you shifts once more, his armor clanging in protest. You sigh and close your eyes, resigning yourself to the noise. Perhaps he will wake safer, perhaps not. But you realize something in the stillness. Soldiers in these camps lived their lives on the edge of decision, torn between comfort and fear. Every choice a wager against death. Even in sleep, war demanded a price. You stir again, dragging your stiff body upright for a moment to catch your breath, and the air inside the tent hits you like a wet slap, thick with the smell of damp wool, smoke, and sweat. It clings to your throat. You push open the flap for just a second, and feel another sensation wash over you. A warm breath, moist and animal, steaming into the night. You glance outside and there, tethered close to the tent, stands a row of horses. Their sides glisten faintly with frost, their nostrils puffing great clouds into the dark. And here you remember another mainstream fact. Medieval soldiers often relied on their animals for warmth. Horses, mules, even oxen tethered near the tents radiated heat that seeped through the canvas, raising the temperature inside by a few precious degrees. It wasn't much, but in a world where 1 degree could mean the difference between life and death, it mattered deeply. Entire cavalry units staked their tents near the picket lines, not just for security but explicitly for this shared warmth. You step closer and press your gloved hand against the flank of a horse. The animal shifts, flicking an ear, but does not shy away. The heat radiates instantly into your palm, surprising in its intensity. You imagine lying against that massive body, your back warmed by a furnace wrapped in hair and muscle. And in truth, some soldiers did just that, curling into the straw alongside their horses, using the animals as giant, living blankets. Strange? Perhaps. Effective? Absolutely. And here's the quirky tidbit. Chronicles from winter campaigns tell of soldiers deliberately leading sheep, or even goats, into their tents. Not for food, but for warmth. The animals bleated and kicked, inevitably soiling the straw. Yet still they were welcomed as living heaters. You chuckle quietly, picturing a knight trying to keep his dignity, while a goat climbs over his bedding. Comfort knows no pride in the cold. Still, there is a debate among historians about just how widespread this practice was. Some argue that only cavalry troops truly benefited, since horses required constant attention and were naturally kept close. Others insist that camp followers and infantrymen also pulled smaller animals into their shelters, especially when the snow piled too high. The written sources are sparse, and so the arguments continue. You can almost hear the voices of scholars, warm in their libraries, debating whether goats really shared tents with knights, while you stand here breathing in the undeniable proof of animal heat. The smell of the horses fills your nose. Musky, earthy, mixed with hay and manure. To a modern nose, it may seem foul, but here in the frozen night, it is strangely reassuring. It smells of life, of warmth, of endurance. You lean closer, your forehead brushing the coarse mane, and for a moment the cold recedes. You close your eyes, almost grateful enough to whisper thanks. Back inside the tent, the men murmur about their tethered beasts. One man brags that he'll sleep against his mare if the night grows colder. Another laughs and says his mule kicks too hard to risk it. A third tells a story of men in Poland who supposedly spooned with their cows in the snow. The tent shakes with muffled laughter, the kind born from exhaustion and desperation. You realize that ridicule and camaraderie both help keep fear away. The straw beneath you still pricks, the cloak still itches, but the thought of those animals just outside eases your dread. They are more than mounts or beasts of burden. They are lifelines. You remember that knights often swore oaths to their horses, treating them almost like comrades in arms. In moments like this, it makes perfect sense. Horses carried soldiers by day and helped keep them alive by night. The air warms slightly as the combined heat of men and beasts seeps together. Condensation beads on the canvas walls, dripping like rain onto your shoulders. The cold has not vanished, but it is dulled. The tent feels less like a tomb and more like a shelter. And you realize that this warmth is communal, but not just human. It is humans and animals, enduring together. You lie back down, listening to the muffled sounds of hooves pawing straw, the occasional snort of a horse, the rhythmic chewing as they grind their feed. It is oddly soothing, like a lullaby of the camp. Your fellow soldiers seem comforted too. Some are humming along to the rhythm, others whispering stories about their mounts, how a horse once saved them, how a mule once carried them through a river, how an ox once dragged a wagon farther than any man could. The debate flickers in your mind again. Did medieval armies really depend this much on animals for warmth, or is it an exaggerated romanticism from later chroniclers? Some scholars suggest the evidence is thin, pointing out that tents, braziers, and cloaks already provided enough explanation for survival. Others counter that the sheer practicality of using animals makes the practice almost certain. You lie there, feeling the heat seeping faintly through the canvas, and you know in your bones that it must have been true. You close your eyes, imagining yourself as part of the herd. Your cloak is your hide. Your breath fogs the air. Your body presses against others for warmth. You are no different from the horse tethered just outside, each of you just waiting for the sun to rise. The thought is humbling, even calming. The cold does not vanish, but it becomes bearable. You burrow deeper into your cloak, straw beneath you, fur across your chest, boots pinching your toes, dagger resting at your side. Around you men snore, mutter, shift. Outside, horses stomp and breathe clouds into the sky. Together, man and beast share the night, clinging to life with nothing more than breath, hide, and stubbornness. And in that moment, you realize survival is not noble, nor elegant, nor even particularly comfortable. It is messy, smelly, cramped, and absurd. But it works. You are still here. You are still breathing. And in a medieval tent on a freezing night, that is triumph enough. You wake again to the sound of a man gulping noisily beside you, the liquid sloshing in a wooden cup before he sighs with deep satisfaction. In the dim light, you catch the sour-sweet scent of wine. He offers the cup toward you with a grin that shows more missing teeth than whole ones. You hesitate, but then you take a swallow. The warmth spreads almost instantly. It is false and fleeting, but for just a moment you feel the illusion of fire in your veins. Here is your mainstream fact. Alcohol was a common companion in medieval camps, especially wine in these southern regions, and ale or mead in the north. It wasn't just for morale. Soldiers genuinely believed that drinking before bed helped ward off the chill, dulling the constant discomfort and lulling them into a necessary sleep. Commanders even issued rations of it, not purely for pleasure, but based on a cold calculation. A tipsy soldier was still alive, while a stone-cold sober one might freeze. The wine burns as it goes down. The tang is sharp, the aftertaste sour from the cheap wooden cask it was drawn from. This isn't fine vintage. It's the rough swill issued by quartermasters, often watered down and spoiled. Yet, after days of shivering, you hardly care. It makes your belly warm, your eyelids heavy, and your aches just a little more distant. Then comes the quirky tidbit. Some soldiers believed spiced wine or mulled ale had almost magical properties, chasing out the frost with cloves, cinnamon, or pepper, if they were lucky enough to have such luxuries. Imagine the scene. A freezing camp where men huddle in cloaks, and one lucky knight sips hot wine laced with cinnamon, like some pampered lord. You can almost smell it, rich and exotic, wafting through the smoke and making every other soldier groan with envy. But historians still question how effective alcohol really was for warmth. Some point out that while drink creates a sensation of heat, it actually dilates blood vessels and causes faster heat loss. Others argue that in a world without modern medicine, that illusion was good enough. It let men fall asleep when otherwise they would have tossed and turned all night in misery. The debate lingers unresolved, leaving you to weigh science against desperation as you take another swallow. The tent stirs as more men pass around their cups. Laughter grows louder. Voices rise in song verses crooked and lewd, echoing against the canvas walls. One man slaps his thigh, another bursts into a hacking cough, but still tries to sing. The wine loosens tongues, eases pain, and momentarily warms the soul, if not the body. You can feel the mood shift from dreary to defiant, as though the men have fooled themselves into believing they are in a tavern rather than a mud pit. The smell of fermented grapes mixes with the musk of wool and smoke. It is sour, earthy, and comforting in its own rough way. You lean back against the straw, cup in hand, and let the fuzz creep into your mind. The cold still nips at your feet, but you hardly notice. The wine is louder than the frost. One soldier tells a story about a captain who swore by burnt wine, heated to steaming and mixed with honey, insisting it kept his men from freezing during a siege. Another interrupts with a bawdy joke about warming the blood in other ways, and the tent erupts into laughter again. You shake your head, but smile despite yourself. Humor and wine are brothers. Both keep men alive when reality bites too hard. You glance around the tent, seeing faces glow red in the brazier's fading light, eyes half-lidded, mouths stained with drink. Some slump onto their straw already, snoring loudly. Others clutch their cups like talismans, sipping slowly, savouring the last drop before surrendering to sleep. It strikes you that this ritual is as much about comfort as it is about warmth. To drink together is to remind one another that you are still human, still alive, still capable of joy in small doses. The night grows quieter as the cups empty. Snores rise, heavy and uneven. A few men mutter in their dreams, some with laughter still bubbling in their throats. You feel yourself drifting too, lulled by the lingering heat in your stomach. For a moment, you almost forget the frozen world beyond the canvas walls. Yet even here, doubt creeps in. You know that the warmth is false, that the wine cannot stop frostbite, that in some ways it even hastens it. You wonder how many soldiers never woke after a night of drinking, lulled into oblivion while the cold crept silently through their veins. Historians suggest it happened more often than recorded. The quiet deaths of men mistaken for simple sleep. The thought sobers you, makes you glance at your own hand gripping the cup. But you drink anyway, because what else is there? Without fire, without furs, without hope, you drink. You close your eyes, let the warmth trick you, and surrender yourself to sleep. You dream of hearths, of taverns, of laughter without fear. For a few short hours, you are not a soldier in a frozen camp. You are simply a man with a cup, safe in the illusion of heat. And when morning comes, when the frost bites again, you will rise with the others, stamping your boots, cursing your numb fingers, and carrying on. Because in this world, survival is built on illusions. And sometimes, illusions are enough. The wine's warmth fades, and the tent sinks into a heavier silence. Men shift in their cloaks, some muttering, some already snoring in a drunken stupor. You close your eyes, hoping sleep will take you, but instead your ears pick up the soft hum of a voice at the far end of the tent. It is low, rhythmic, more chant than song. Soon another joins, then a third, until the murmurs blend into something you recognize. Not a tavern tune, not a bawdy ballad, but a prayer. That's your mainstream fact for the night. Before sleep, many medieval soldiers prayed. In a world where cold, hunger, and the threat of ambush loomed over every dusk, faith was as practical a tool as wool or straw. Chronicles often mention evening prayers in camp, whether whispered alone or led by a chaplain. Soldiers asked for warmth, for safety, for forgiveness, and most of all, for the strength to wake up alive the next morning. You listened to the muttered Latin phrases, half understood by most of the men repeating them. Pater Noster, Ave Maria. The syllables roll like waves, carrying with them a calm that the smoky air alone cannot provide. Even men too drunk to stand join in, their words slurred, but earnest. You feel the sound wrap around you like a second cloak. It is not heat, but it is comfort. And then comes the quirky tidbit. Some soldiers carried tiny relics or charms, believing these held power against the cold as much as against enemy swords. A sliver of a saint's bone, a fragment of cloth said to be holy, even a pebble from a church floor. These little talismans were tucked into boots or sewn into cloaks. You picture a hardened mercenary, clutching a bone fragment in one hand, while muttering prayers with cracked lips, convinced it will keep the frost from stealing his breath. Yet historians still argue about how much of this faith was sincere and how much was ritual. Did soldiers truly believe divine intervention kept them warm, or was it simply a habit that soothed the mind? Some scholars insist the prayers were pragmatic psychology, a way to ease terror and quiet the mind before sleep. Others believe devotion ran deeper, that men trusted saints and angels as much as straw and fire. The truth, as usual, is murky. But as you lie there, you feel how the rhythm of prayer steadies your heartbeat, how it makes the tent feel less like a coffin and more like a chapel. One soldier beside you whispers a private plea, not in Latin, but in the rough tongue of his village. He begs for his wife and children to be kept safe, for his own body to endure another night. You hear the catch in his voice and realize faith is not just ritual, it is also longing. Another soldier clutches a wooden cross, his thumb tracing its edges until the grooves shine smooth. In the glow of the dying brazier, the wood looks worn enough to have traveled through dozens of campaigns, perhaps handed down through generations. The atmosphere in the tent shifts. The rowdiness of wine fades, replaced by something quieter, steadier. Even those who do not murmur prayers lie silently, listening. The howling wind outside sounds distant, less threatening. For a few minutes, you almost believe the canvas itself is blessed, made stronger by the words whispered within. You let your own mind drift, thinking of how faith and fear walk hand in hand. You don't know if the prayer truly keeps the cold at bay, but you do know that your body relaxes, that your teeth stop chattering, that you feel less alone. Perhaps that is miracle enough. There is a story whispered from one side of the tent of a siege where soldiers swore an apparition of a saint walked among them at night, cloaking them in warmth so they did not freeze. The man who tells it insists his grandfather saw it himself. Others chuckle skeptically, but no one openly denies it. When you are this cold, hope, even absurd hope, is a welcome blanket. The smell of incense even comes to your mind, though there is none here. You imagine how some wealthier camps, especially on crusade, might have had chaplains burning herbs or resin during prayers, filling tents with sweet smoke instead of the sour musk you breathe now. You envy that vision. But then again, you remind yourself that even this half-drunken, half-mumbled prayer is a kind of incense, not to the nose, but to the heart. The minutes stretch, the prayers taper off, and silence reclaims the space. Yet the comfort lingers. The tent no longer feels like a cold trap, but like a sanctuary, thin and fragile though it is. You curl deeper into your cloak, straw beneath you, boots still on, fur across your chest, dagger at your side. Around you, men drift to sleep with lips still moving, words trailing into dreams. You sigh, letting your eyes close. Faith, relic, prayer, whether superstition or salvation, it eases you enough to surrender to rest. The frost may bite, the wind may howl, but for this one night, you believe you are guarded. The night drags on, and though the prayers have quieted, the camp is never truly silent. A cough here, a groan there, the steady shuffling of men trying to twist themselves into bearable positions. You roll over and suddenly notice something that stings your pride as much as your skin. The sound of laughter drifting from a neighboring pavilion. The tone is lighter, freer. It is not the coarse chuckles of men huddled like sardines, but the relaxed mirth of officers, their tent glowing faintly from within. Here's a widely attested reality, rank-shaped comfort in medieval camps. Commanders and knights slept under larger pavilions, often round or rectangular structures supported by stout poles, while ordinary soldiers squeezed into low canvas shelters barely big enough to crouch in. In the Bayeux tapestry itself, you can see Norman tents depicted tall and colourful, an artistic reminder that the wealthy brought their comforts even to war. You glance toward that glowing tent, bitterly aware of the difference. Within it, officers lounge on rugs or pallets, perhaps even elevated from the frozen ground on wooden platforms. Some sip the last of their spiced wine. Others recline on fur-lined cushions. Meanwhile, you pull your cloak tighter and press your face into damp straw, feeling the cold seep into your cheeks. And now, for an odd note that survives in chronicles. Some high-ranking leaders brought feather beds into the field. Imagine that. While common soldiers stamped their feet to keep blood flowing, a duke or baron stretched luxuriously on goose down. There are even accounts of nobles shipping entire household furnishings to campaign grounds, their pavilions resembling small houses more than tents. You can almost hear the resentment bubbling among the rank and file. Men muttering about their lord's velvet curtains while their own canvas leaks rain onto their faces. Modern researchers remain divided about just how extreme this disparity was. Some argue that stories of feather beds and lavish furnishings were exaggerations, written to mock noble decadence. Others suggest that for the wealthiest, such indulgences were perfectly real, because war was as much about display as survival. Evidence of ornate tent poles and decorated fabrics found in archaeology does lend some weight to the latter view. Still, the truth likely varied. Some lords indulged, others endured. The glow of the officer's pavilion nags at you. The faint silhouettes of men shifting across thick rugs are a cruel reminder of inequality. You wonder if they ever feel guilt, or if comfort numbs them too well. In your tent, someone spits into the straw and mutters a curse. Another soldier whispers a bitter joke. When the frost kills us, the captains will use our cloaks as napkins. The laughter that follows is sharp, tinged with spite. The smell wafting from that richer tent is different too. Instead of smoke and sour wool, you catch hints of burning resin incense perhaps, or aromatic wood. A luxury meant not just to mask the stench, but to soothe nerves. You imagine lying there, eyes closed while sweet smoke curls around you, convincing you that the battlefield is miles away. Compared to the rank air in your shelter, it seems another world. Yet, in a strange way, resentment fuels survival. The grumbling in your tent binds you closer to your fellows. Your misery is shared, and so is your anger. The gap between classes is obvious, but it also gives you something to mock, to rail against, to cling to, as proof that you are tougher than those pampered figures across the field. If they need velvet curtains, you think, then they are weaker than you. One soldier recounts a tale of a noble's pavilion collapsing in a storm, burying his feather bed in mud. The tent erupts in laughter, loud enough that you fear it will carry, but no one cares. For a few moments, laughter is warmer than any cloak. The wind rattles both tents, the grand one and yours, and you take a certain grim satisfaction in knowing that canvas is canvas, whether stitched with silk or hemp. In the end, the storm treats all fabric equally. Perhaps that is the only true equality here. The sky doesn't care if you are knight or peasant. The frost gnaws at all. Still, when the laughter dies down, and the officer's pavilion glows steadily on, envy seeps back into your bones. You curl tighter into your straw, muttering under your breath. The cold will not break you tonight, even if comfort belongs to others. Survival is its own victory, and you will cling to that when the frost whispers otherwise. You drift in and out of shallow sleep until a new sound stirs you, the tearing rip of fabric and the shuffle of feet in the dark. At first you think raiders have slipped into the camp, but then you hear the unmistakable thump of wood against earth, the grunt of men hauling something heavy. You lift the tent flap slightly and see shadows moving from the distant village. Piles of canvas, rope, and armfuls of straw are being dragged toward the army's rows of shelters. And it strikes you with a jolt of clarity. Those tents you've been huddling under aren't always the neat, orderly supplies issued from some royal storehouse. Much of the time, they are simply taken. That's a fact, grounded in countless campaigns. Soldiers routinely dismantled barns, stripped cottages, and plundered weaving shops to outfit their camps. War consumed not only lives but roofs and rafters too. Chronicles tell of villages left bare overnight, their walls gutted for timber, their thatch stolen for bedding. The battlefield didn't just bleed men, it bled entire landscapes. You watch as a small group passes, arms full of a tapestry torn straight from a church wall. They laugh while staggering under its weight, boasting that it will make fine insulation for their captain's tent. You lie back on your straw, seething at the unfairness, but also aware of the grim practicality. Survival always came at someone else's expense. A curious image lingers in your mind. Soldiers sleeping beneath canvas, dyed with painted saints. Once meant to glorify God inside a chapel, now those same holy figures sag in the mud, their eyes staring blankly at the night sky. It's a detail too strange to ignore. One of those grotesque ironies of war. You warm yourself with stolen sanctity, with no thought of blasphemy when frost stiffens your fingers. And yet, historians remain divided about how systematic this looting really was. Some argue that official quartermasters supplied tents, especially for royal armies, and that tales of theft were exaggerated by chroniclers eager to paint soldiers as brutes. Others counter that the archaeological evidence torn textiles, reused beams, even charred church fittings found near camp remains, suggests the practice was widespread. The debate has no neat conclusion, but what is certain is that armies rarely carried everything they needed. They took what they could from whomever they could, and survival left little room for scruples. Back inside your tent, the murmurs rise as men gossip about the day's plunder. One swears he saw an officer bedding down on velvet curtains, stripped from a manor. Another complains bitterly that common soldiers are left with damp straw while their lords sleep on brocade. The resentment simmers like a slow fire, another form of heat in the freezing night. The smell drifts in next. Fresh hay mixed with smoke and something sharper. The scent of paint and wax scraped from looted icons. You wrinkle your nose, imagining the ruined homes behind those smells. Somewhere, A villager wakes in a roofless house, shivering, cursing the soldiers who now lie warmer because of his loss. You wonder if he will survive the winter at all. One soldier nearby shrugs when the subject comes up. "Better them than us," he mutters. "They'll hate us either way." Another, younger and less hardened, shakes his head but says nothing. You sense his unease, the lingering thought that every comfort here is stolen. Yet no one discards their gains. No one marches into the dark to return a single strand of thatch. You curl back into your cloak, the prickly straw beneath you suddenly heavier with guilt. The knowledge gnaws at you. Your warmth tonight might be bought at the price of a farmer's misery. And still, your body refuses to surrender it. Cold erases morality. When frost grips your bones, you cling to whatever keeps you alive, no matter where it came from. As the night deepens, the wind rattles the canvas. You close your eyes and picture the village, now empty. Its walls hollow, its roofs stripped bare. The camp stands stronger for it, glowing faintly with stolen light. Survival, it seems, is always theft of life, of comfort, of warmth. And you, wrapped in wool and fur, lying on straw that once belonged to someone else, are as much thief as soldier. You wake with a start, and for a moment you don't know what has roused you. Then you feel it. Your breath, stiff on your upper lip, hardened into a brittle crust. You reach up, and your fingers meet tiny, sharp shards of ice, clinging tenaciously to your mustache and beard. The sensation is profoundly bizarre, like your own body has turned traitor, freezing itself from the inside out. It is a well-recorded reality that soldiers often woke to find their breath crystallized in their facial hair or even in the folds of their cloaks. Medieval chronicles, especially during sieges in northern Europe, describe men scraping frost from their faces and clothing before they could even stand. It wasn't just a fleeting discomfort. It was proof of how viciously cold the nights became, when even the act of breathing turned into a trap that iced you over. You tilt your head and notice others suffering the same fate. A man nearby rubs his beard roughly with his gloved hands, snapping off tiny white flakes that fall onto the straw like snow. Another swears and spits, his saliva freezing before it even hits the ground. The sight is comical in a cruel way. Rows of warriors who look like they've dipped their faces in sugar. And here's a peculiar little detail. Some soldiers smeared animal fat or even sticky pine resin into their beards before sleep, claiming it kept frost from clinging. Imagine that. Faces slick and greasy, shining in the brazier's glow. Men grinning as though proud of their innovation. The smell, of course, would have been horrendous, a rank animal reek. But when your choice is reeking like a slaughterhouse or waking with an icicle beard, the decision is easier than you'd think. Specialists in medieval life remain uncertain just how widespread such tricks were. Some say the stories of frozen beards are exaggerated, flourishes from chroniclers eager to dramatize winter suffering. Others argue that the phenomenon is perfectly plausible, given what we know about simple condensation and sub-zero nights in canvas tents. Archaeological traces can't exactly prove frost on beards, so the debate remains unresolved. But if you've ever stepped outside in bitter cold, you know the truth doesn't need parchment to validate it. The air inside the tent feels sharp, slicing with every breath. You cover your mouth with your cloak, inhaling through the wool, hoping the fabric will warm the air before it reaches your lungs. Around you, the chorus of coughs grows louder, rough and ragged. Cold damages not just skin, but throats and lungs, and you realize that every soldier here risks illness as much as frostbite. The raw sound of men hacking in the dark is as constant as the flap of the canvas in the wind. You scrape your own mustache roughly, watching bits of frost fall onto your lap. They glitter briefly before melting into new damp spots, soaking your cloak. The damp is almost worse than the frost itself. Wet wool clings and chills faster than dry. You pull the cloak tighter, muttering under your breath. Survival here is never just one battle, but a dozen little skirmishes against frost, against damp, against your own body's betrayal. One man jokes hoarsely. At least we save on sugar. We carry it on our lips. The tent chuckles weakly, though no one has the strength for true laughter. Humor becomes another blanket. Thin, but precious. You join in the chuckling, even as your fingers ache from rubbing your beard raw. The smell inside the tent is heavier tonight. Smoke from a faint brazier, sweat sealed in damp cloaks. And now, the faint animal musk of grease rubbed into beards. It is pungent, close, oppressive, but in an odd way, reassuring. Each scent confirms that you and your comrades are still alive, still exhaling frost into the air. The canvas itself crackles with frost, its edges stiff like parchment. You tap it with a finger, and a thin sheet of ice flakes down onto your hand. You realize the entire tent has become a frozen cocoon, every breath of its occupants painting a fresh layer of ice onto the fabric. And yet, beneath that icy crust, you endure. You lie back again, feeling the weight of fatigue press into your chest. The frost melts slowly from your mustache, dripping onto your lips. It tastes faintly of iron and smoke. You close your eyes, shivering, and let the absurdity of it all wash over you. Mighty soldiers, reduced to scraping their own frozen breath from their faces. But survival often looks ridiculous. It is not the glory of battle or the pride of banners. It is frost in your beard, damp in your cloak, straw scratching your back, boots bruising your feet. It is waking each morning stiff and sore, yet waking nonetheless. And so you drift back into fitful half-sleep. The crackle of ice in your beard is a reminder that you are still breathing, still alive, still stubborn enough to endure. The frost may claim your mustache, but not your will, not tonight. The night refuses to loosen its grip, and by now your body has learned every shade of cold, the sting that bites your fingertips, the dull ache deep in your bones, the shivers that ripple uncontrollably through your frame. You roll over, desperate for a new position, and hear a faint clink. Someone nearby is shifting a bundle of stones wrapped in cloth. One slips free, and when it touches your hand, you recoil in surprise. It is warm. Not blazing, not fiery, but radiating a steady, precious, fading heat. This is one of the clever, simple realities of medieval camps. Soldiers heated stones in the fire before nightfall and carried them into their tents, sometimes wrapping them in spare cloth or leather to prevent burns. The stones, baked until they glowed faintly red, retained warmth for hours, slowly releasing it as the tent plunged into darkness. Chronicles from Northern Europe and even Crusader camps mention this practice, a humble but effective trick against death by frost. You draw the stone toward you, cradling it in both hands. Its warmth seeps into your palms, a tiny miracle. Gratefully, you tuck it beneath your cloak, pressing it against your chest. It is astonishing how something so ordinary, just a lump of rock, can feel like treasure greater than gold. You close your eyes briefly, savoring the comfort. And here's a curious flourish. Some soldiers supposedly tucked these hot stones into boots or even under their tunics, nestled against their bellies. Imagine the sight. Grim warriors carrying little glowing bundles like infants swaddled in cloth. A few unlucky ones burned themselves badly, the stones searing through fabric and raising blisters. Still, risk was preferable to freezing. Even pain could be better than numbness. Scholars remain unsure how widespread this practice truly was. Some argue that heating stones was mostly a peasant trick, learned from rural households that used hearthstones to warm bedding. Others claim that soldiers across Europe adopted it readily, given its simplicity. Archaeological finds of scorched, fire-cracked rocks in former campsites hint that it happened often, though the evidence cannot confirm whether they were for cooking, forges, or warmth. The uncertainty lingers, like smoke in the air. You press the stone closer, letting it anchor you against the night. Its weight is reassuring, a reminder that survival often lies in the simplest acts. Around you, other soldiers shuffle their own bundles, muttering contentedly when they find a still warm one. The rustle of cloth and the faint clatter of rocks fill the tent like an odd, muffled percussion ensemble. It is both comical and comforting. An army of men tucked in with their hot stones, pretending, if only for a moment, that they have hearths of their own. The smell of scorched earth clings to your hands. It mixes with smoke, wool, and damp straw, adding another layer to the camp's unique perfume. You inhale deeply, and though it isn't pleasant, It is grounding. This smell is proof of ingenuity, proof that men will wrest warmth from anything, even the earth itself. One soldier near you whispers about how his grandmother back home used to place hot stones at the foot of her bed on icy nights. Another adds that in his village, women heated bricks and wrapped them in towels for children. The stories ripple through the tent, weaving memory and survival together. You realize how war borrows from home, stealing every scrap of domestic, humble knowledge and repurposing it for the battlefield. But the warmth fades slowly, inevitably. You can feel the stone cooling, the heat bleeding away into the night. You clutch it tighter, as though you can will it to last longer. It reminds you of life itself, bright and fierce for a while, then slowly dimming, yet cherished to the very end. You think of how many soldiers clung to these stones, whispering prayers or curses as they cooled in their arms. The debate flickers in your mind. Were such measures enough, or merely symbolic gestures against overwhelming cold? Some historians dismiss them as minor comforts, while others argue they might have been life-saving in the harshest winters. You don't need a lecture to know that right now, this fading warmth feels like the difference between sleep and endless shivering. Your eyelids droop, your breath fogs the air, and you curl around the stone like it is the last ember of a dying fire. Around you, men do the same, their silhouettes hunched, arms folded over their hidden treasures. The tent creaks in the wind, frost rattling against the canvas. But inside, dozens of stones glow invisibly in the dark, their warmth stitching a fragile barrier between the living and the frozen. And as you drift into half-sleep, you realize something simple yet profound. Survival in these camps wasn't just about grand strategies or knightly valor. It was about tricks like this: warming a stone, wrapping it in cloth, and holding it close until morning. The great battles filled the chronicles, but the small victories, like this faint warmth against your chest, were what truly kept armies alive. You surrender to the warmth while it lasts, knowing it will be gone by dawn, yet grateful for every single moment it endures. The stone cools, your body stiffens again, but you cling to the memory of its heat. It is proof that even in the darkest night, the earth itself can lend you strength. The stone has cooled, its heat no more than a ghost against your ribs, and you awake to the sound of wind gnawing at the canvas. A flap bangs loose, letting in a sharp draft that makes the whole tent groan like a ship at sea. You pull your cloak tighter and realize something you have always known but never wanted to admit. Winter campaigning was never the plan. The cold was an enemy no commander wanted to face. This is a matter of record. Armies in the Middle Ages generally avoided campaigning in deep winter. Campaign seasons usually ran from late spring through early autumn. The harvest had to be gathered. Supply lines needed passable roads, and men were far less likely to desert when conditions weren't unbearable. When possible, kings and captains disbanded their forces before the frost set in. Yet, as you lie here with breath clouding the air, you know, exceptions abounded. Sieges dragged on for months, sometimes years. Retreat wasn't always an option, and the cold became just another front in the war. You think of the Great Siege of Antioch during the First Crusade, when soldiers shivered through the winters of 1097 to 1098, eating boiled leather and gnawing on rats to survive. Chroniclers describe men dropping in the snow outside the walls, their corpses stiff before morning light. You picture yourself among them, breath frosting, bones aching, waiting for a dawn that never warms. And then you remember a curious, almost absurd custom. Some commanders deliberately kept men marching, even in bitter weather, because the constant movement kept blood flowing. One account tells of entire units forced to march in circles around the camp just before bedding down, stamping feet and swinging arms to beat back the frost. You imagine 1,000 weary soldiers trudging in rings like some bizarre midnight dance, too exhausted to complain, but too fearful to stop. Modern historians still wrestle with the question of how often true winter warfare occurred. Some insist it was rare, that most kings avoided it, except in dire necessity. Others argue that in regions like Scandinavia or the Baltic, cold weather campaigns were normal, even strategic, since frozen rivers made for easier highways than muddy summer roads. The evidence varies by region, leaving scholars divided. But here, inside this sagging tent, you know one truth. Whether by choice or by cruel fate, winter has always been the harshest battlefield. The tent creaks again, the flap slapping violently against its pole. You hear mutters from your comrades as another draft snakes in. One curses the commander who dragged them here in winter. Another swears he will desert come morning. Yet no one rises. The frost has pinned you all down as surely as chains. The smells are sharper tonight. Smoke from hastily dampened fires, sweat thick and cold in wool. The sour tang of breath frozen in the air. The odours mingle with the faint scent of pine drifting from the forests nearby, a cruel reminder of nature's beauty while you suffer at its mercy. You close your eyes, imagining those trees as shelter, thick and safe. But you know in reality they are bare, skeletal, as exposed as you are. You roll onto your back, staring at the canvas roof, its surface glittering faintly with frost. You can trace the shape of ice crystals spreading along the seams, delicate and cruel. Each gust of wind makes the whole structure shudder, and you wonder how many tents collapse outright under the weight of snow. You imagine men waking, buried, clawing their way out of suffocating drifts. Or worse, never waking at all. One of the older soldiers near you begins muttering about past campaigns, when entire armies lost more men to frost than to swords. He says he once saw bodies lined up in rows, their faces peaceful, as if they had simply fallen asleep. No wounds, no battle cries, just the quiet victory of cold. The tent falls silent as he speaks. No one dares break the spell. You feel the truth of his words in your bones. Yet there is another side. A younger soldier counters with a story of a siege in summer, where disease and rot claimed more lives than winter ever could. He insists that cold may be cruel, but heat and filth are crueler still. The men grumble, half agreeing, half scoffing. The debate is timeless. Which season is deadlier? Which enemy more merciless? Winter's frost or summer's plague? No answer comes, only silence, and the restless shuffle of men searching for sleep. You breathe deeply, the air sharp as needles, and let the argument wash over you. In truth, both sides are right. War has no gentle season. The year turns, and suffering just takes a new form. Tonight, though, it is winter's turn to claim its due. The hours crawl. You press your boots against another man's shins for warmth, ignoring his grumble. You tug your cloak over your face to block the draft, inhaling the sour, smoky fabric until your head spins. You try not to think of the noble officers who will wake tomorrow in pavilions lined with rugs, or the villagers who shiver in roofless homes stripped for your straw. Instead, you focus on the rhythm of survival. Stamp your feet, rub your hands, breathe slowly, and pray morning comes quickly. Eventually, your eyelids sag. Sleep comes not as comfort, but as surrender, dragging you down into half-dreams of endless marches across frozen fields. In your dreams, you walk on ice that cracks beneath every step, your boots stiff, your breath trailing behind you in long white ribbons. You wake briefly, heart racing, but realize you are still in the tent, still alive, still trapped in winter's grip. And so you settle again, muttering a curse at the season itself. Winter was never meant for war. And yet here you are, one more soldier testing the patience of frost. You close your eyes, resigned, and cling to the fragile hope that dawn will break the siege of the night. You shift in your straw bed, the cold gnawing steadily, and your mind drifts to comparisons. Not all soldiers fought the same way against the night. You realize that what works here in this muddy field might fail utterly elsewhere. You think of distant lands of Scandinavia in the north, of Spain in the south, and realize the tricks of survival varied as much as the people who used them. One thing is firmly attested in the chronicles. Northern troops, hardened to brutal, relentless winters, relied heavily on reindeer hides, seal skins, and layered wool garments. Viking descendants in later centuries still wrapped themselves in furs so thick they resembled bears more than men. Their tents were lined with animal skins, and some even built temporary snow walls to shield their camps from the wind. Compared to your flimsy canvas, that sounds like a luxury born of necessity. In stark contrast, soldiers from warmer lands trusted in their standard wool cloaks and layered tunics. Less prepared for deep frost, Spanish and Italian troops sometimes suffered terribly when dragged into northern campaigns. Accounts from the Hundred Years' War describe southern mercenaries bewildered by snow, huddling desperately in cloaks far too thin to stop the bite. One chronicler even noted that men from Aragon cursed the sky itself when the frost pinned them in place. The clash of climates turned every campaign into its own cruel experiment. And then there are the stranger methods. You recall the story of Baltic warriors who supposedly rubbed themselves with bear grease before sleep, believing it sealed in their warmth. You picture the tent filled with the reek of rancid fat, men glistening like wax candles, snoring loudly while their comrades gagged. It may sound absurd, but desperation makes all tricks worth trying. Odd customs like these ripple through the records, half survival, half superstition. Scholars, as ever, are divided over how much weight to give these regional variations. Some argue that climate determined everything, that soldiers carried their homeland habits wherever they marched, adapting poorly to new environments. Others counter that armies were quick to copy what worked, learning from locals and enemies alike. The evidence is patchy. A mention in a chronicle here, a scrap of fur-lined cloth in an excavation there. Still, the argument continues, leaving only fragments of certainty. You turn onto your back and imagine yourself as a soldier in Scandinavia. Snow piled high outside, but your tent warm with reindeer hides and felted wool. The air still bites, but you endure. Then you imagine yourself as a Spaniard dragged north, teeth chattering, cloak sodden with sleet, cursing the day you left home. Which is worse, to live in cold and be hardened to it, or to stumble into it utterly unprepared? The smells shift depending on the vision. In the north, your nose fills with the musk of hides, resinous pine smoke, and fish oil lamps. In the south, it is wet wool, soaked with rain, smoke from olive wood fires, and the faint tang of cheap wine. Both camps stink, but the scents tell different stories. Survival always has a smell. You realize that more deeply with every passing night. The men in your tent begin a hushed conversation about past marches. One recalls fighting with mercenaries from Castile who shivered so badly they could barely hold their crossbows. Another swears he saw men from Sweden stride barefoot across snow without complaint, their skin raw, but their faces calm. The contrast stuns you, makes you marvel at human stubbornness. What breaks one man barely touches another. You wrap your cloak tighter and wonder which kind you are, the hardened northerner or the shivering southerner. The truth, you suspect, is somewhere in between. You endure because you must, not because you were born to it. The debate among the soldiers drifts into jokes. One man laughs that northerners sleep with seals, while southerners sleep with goats. Another claims the French are worst of all, complaining in every climate, neither hardy in cold nor at ease in heat. The laughter spreads, warming the air more than any brazier could. It is the same lesson repeated night after night. Humour is insulation. The tent rustles as the wind rattles it again, and you press your boots deeper into the straw. You imagine these distant camps, the techniques they use, the sounds and smells that shape them. You realize survival is not universal. It is a patchwork quilt of habits, tricks, and inherited wisdoms. What keeps a man alive in Norway might fail in Lombardy, and what comforts a Spaniard might be useless in Livonia. The cold respects no uniform, no banner, no tongue. And yet, across all these regions, one truth unites them. Men endure. They adapt, they borrow, they improvise. They huddle in cloaks, smear themselves in grease, curl against beasts, and pray to saints. Each land gives its soldiers different tools, but the struggle is the same, the fight to wake when dawn comes. You close your eyes again, letting the wind batter the canvas, and for a fleeting moment you feel connected to all of them, the fur-wrapped northerners, the wool-swaddled southerners, the grease-smeared Balts. Across centuries and miles you all share the same shiver, the same groan, the same stubborn breath fogging the frozen air. The night staggers on, though you've lost all sense of time. The sky outside could be midnight or dawn. Both feel equally distant. You shift in the straw and hear the steady creak of leather harnesses. For a moment, you think horses are being saddled for a pre-dawn ride, but then it dawns on you. No, that sound is closer. It is the sound of men rolling restlessly, boots squeaking, straps tugging against their tunics. And you remember the truth that every soldier knows deep in his aching bones. Warmth comes not only from what you wear at night, but from what you did all day. It is a fact every commander understood. Marching kept soldiers alive. Movement pumped blood, drove out stiffness, and blunted the cold. An army that kept moving by day endured the night far better, however miserable the tents. Chroniclers of winter campaigns often noted how men dreaded long halts. Stillness was deadly. Better to trudge through mud or snow than sit idly while the frost chewed at fingers and toes. You recall the endless tramping of the day, mud sucking at your boots, your cloak heavy with sleet, your breath wheezing clouds into the air. At the time, you cursed every single step. Now, lying motionless, you almost miss it. The aching march was cruel, but it kept blood hot, toes tingling, muscles alive. Here in the stillness, your body becomes a slow, dying ember. And then there is the peculiar custom some soldiers swore by. Before bed, men would rise and run laps around the perimeter of the camp, stamping and clapping like drunken dancers until their bodies steamed. You picture the sight. Dozens of weary figures circling the tents under moonlight, sweat freezing on their brows, even as they crawled back into the straw. Ridiculous, perhaps, but desperate habits often worked. Specialists still puzzle over how deliberate these routines were. Some argue commanders ordered them, enforcing movement as a form of discipline. Others suggest soldiers invented the practice themselves, small circles of men choosing to fight the cold in the only way they knew. The evidence is fragmentary references in letters, anecdotes in chronicles, but the image lingers. An army warming itself, not with fire, but with its own frantic motion. You stretch your legs under the cloak and feel the dull ache of yesterday's march. Every joint throbs, every tendon complains. Yet part of you is grateful. The soreness means you are still alive, still moving. Around you, men murmur about tomorrow's route, how many miles, what rivers to cross, what villages to strip for food and straw. No one wants to march, but everyone knows they must. To lie still too long is to die. The smells of the camp reinforce this memory. Damp leather, horse sweat, and churned earth. All the scents of the march cling stubbornly to your cloak. They remind you of daytime survival, of stamping boots in rhythm, of shields banging together in crude songs, of hands swinging like pendulums to keep blood moving. The odors are sour, but oddly, they comfort you, proof that your body is not yet surrendered to the frost. One man groans and mutters about a march in Burgundy where they trudged until midnight, not for strategy, but simply to keep from freezing. Another laughs darkly, saying commanders lied, pretending every extra mile was tactical, when really it was just survival disguised as military wisdom. The tent chuckles softly. Perhaps both are true. Your mind wanders to the irony of it all. You complain at every endless march, yet you long for it when night falls. War breeds contradictions. The same feet that blister by day are the ones you thank by night for keeping your blood alive. You curse the mud, then pray for another march, if only to feel warmth again. Survival is not consistent. It shifts with the hour, the weather, the whim of chance. The wind groans through the ropes, and you curl tighter. You imagine yourself outside again, slogging through snow under a pale sky. The rhythm of steps, numbing thought. You hear the crunch of boots, the groan of carts, the snorts of horses. Miserable though it is, marching gives you control. Each step is proof you are still fighting, still refusing to yield. In the tent, you are passive prey to the cold. On the road, at least you strike back with every pace. The men around you fall quiet, some dozing, some muttering half dreams of tomorrow's route. You lie awake, aware of the stillness in your body, longing for motion. You flex your toes inside your boots, stamp them lightly against the straw, pretending you are still walking. It is pitiful, but it is enough to reassure you. You are not frozen yet. The historians may debate how much marching was tactical and how much was survival, but for you, the answer is obvious. The road itself is a shield. Each mile, a weapon against death. You close your eyes, humming faintly the rhythm of marching songs, and let your body imagine it is moving still. Sleep creeps closer, wrapping you like a cloak, and you surrender to it with the faintest smile. You wake again this time, not to frost or footsteps, but to the sound of low voices weaving together, the kind of rhythm that pulls you gently out of half-dreams and into the present. At first, you think it is prayer again, but then you catch a familiar lilt. It is a song, a rough ballad, the kind soldiers have carried from village to village, patched with new verses every time a campfire retells it. There's no denying the fact. Music and song were as much a survival tool as cloaks or fires. Chroniclers occasionally describe soldiers gathering around dwindling embers, lifting their voices not for glory, but simply for warmth of spirit. In the crushing hush of a frozen night, a simple tune could be a second blanket, woven of memory and humor. It was a way to remind yourself you were still alive, still human, not just another body stiffening in the frost. The men croon in uneven harmony, their voices cracked from the cold air. Some are too weary to hold the tune, others too loud with drink. The lyrics shift, moving between a deep longing for home and mocking their commanders. You smile at the refrain, half a curse, half a joke poking fun at the noblemen in their velvet pavilions. Laughter breaks the rhythm, but it doesn't matter. The laughter is part of the song. And here's one of those curious details. Some soldiers kept rattles, simple instruments carved from gourds or fashioned crudely from bones, just to keep time with their singing. You picture a man shaking one now, straw rustling as he taps his foot, the sound filling the tent with something resembling joy. Crude, yes, but when your choices are silence or laughter, you choose laughter. Scholars continue to wonder just how much of this music was ritual and how much was pure improvisation. Was it organized, led by a designated singer, a half-bard, half-soldier, who knew all the verses? Or was it spontaneous, drunken mumbling turning into a chorus entirely by accident? Some argue the tradition of marching songs must have carried naturally into camp life. Others insist the cold nights were too harsh for such wasted breath. No clear answer exists. What remains are mere fragments, verses scribbled in the margins of manuscripts, faint echoes of melodies long lost. But here, in this moment, you don't need parchment evidence. You can hear it, feel it, almost see it. The song binding these men closer than the canvas walls ever could. The cold recedes, not gone, but quieter, drowned out by the voices. The air smells the same: wool, smoke, sweat, but it seems less oppressive now. The rhythm of the song moves your heart faster, warms you in a way a fire never could. You hum along quietly, not knowing the words, but catching the tune. The man beside you slaps your shoulder, grinning, urging you to join. Soon your voice wavers into the chorus, awkward but sincere. The others cheer you, though it is little more than a wheeze from dry lungs. You laugh despite yourself, realizing the truth. The cold can take your strength, your comfort, but not your ability to mock it in song. Another soldier launches into a bawdy verse about fleas in his straw, and the tent erupts. For a moment, the laughter is so loud it drowns the wind outside. Men clutch their sides, tears freezing on their cheeks as they howl. The song collapses into cackles, then rebuilds itself on another verse, slower, sadder this time. A homesick melody about wives, about bread, about fields that wait for them. The mood shifts like smoke, one moment rowdy, the next tender. The flicker of the brazier catches their faces, and you see them softened, almost childlike hardened men, swaying together, voices trembling with memories of home. You close your eyes and picture your own hearth, the voices of your family, the familiar creak of your own bed. It aches in your chest, but it warms you too. Nostalgia is another kind of insulation. The debate will continue long after you're gone. Did soldiers really sing this much? Or are chroniclers exaggerating for colour? Archaeologists can dig up pots and weapons, but no one can exhume a melody. Still, as you lie here, letting the chorus wash over you, you know it doesn't matter. Even if the record is silent, the truth is written in breath. Men always sing when they are cold, because silence is worse. The ballad trails off, voices dropping into murmurs, then fading into snores. The warmth it left lingers like embers, glowing softly in the dark. You curl into your cloak again, straw pricking your back, boots stiff against your feet, but you feel steadier than before. The night hasn't grown warmer, but your heart has. And so you drift back into shallow sleep, the last notes still humming faintly in your head, carrying you toward dreams where the cold cannot follow. The song has faded into silence, replaced now only by the steady crackle of men shifting in their straw. You roll to one side, your nose pressed against the damp canvas, and catch a faint herbal scent. At first, you think it's just smoke drifting from outside, but then you notice stalks and leaves tucked beneath the bedding. One soldier nearby pulls a handful from his cloak sage, dried and brittle, and crushes it in his fingers before scattering it under his mat. The smell sharpens, earthy and bitter, cutting through the heavy musk of wool and sweat. It dawns on you. Some men stuffed their bedding with herbs, believing it would ward off illness and keep vermin at bay. Chroniclers occasionally mention sage, juniper, or even garlic being scattered beneath straw. That's a genuine practice from the period, born partly of rudimentary medical theory, partly of superstition. Herbs were thought to purify the air, repel fleas, and keep the body's humours balanced. Whether or not it truly worked, it gave men a crucial sense of protection, something precious when survival was never guaranteed. You reach down and pick up a stalk yourself, sniffing its sharp scent. It tingles in your nose, almost refreshing compared to the sour stink of wet wool. A soldier mutters that juniper smoke drives away sickness. Another swears that garlic under the straw keeps the lungs strong. You can't help but smile at the mixture of conviction and desperation. And here's one of those curious practices that borders on the absurd. Some armies apparently burned bundles of herbs inside the tent, filling the air with smoke so thick men coughed themselves to tears. The belief was that disease lingered in foul air, and if you drove out the stink with clean smoke, you drove out sickness too. You imagine it now. Half a dozen men hacking, eyes streaming, the tent thick with sage fumes. You laugh quietly. Maybe it kept the plague at bay, or maybe it just made everyone too dizzy to notice the cold. Modern scholars still wrangle over the question of how common these herbal measures really were. Some suggest they were widespread, drawing on local village remedies adapted to camp life. Others argue that they were luxuries, possible only when an army lingered near fertile countryside where herbs could be gathered. The archaeological record leaves hints charred juniper twigs found in old fire pits, garlic bulbs, preserved in refuse heaps, but the debate about their true purpose endures. Were they medicine, or simply flavor for rations? The tent fills gradually with the mixed scents. Sage, sharp and bitter, garlic, pungent and heavy, straw, sweet but decaying. It is a strange perfume, but it successfully masks the persistent stench of damp boots and unwashed bodies. You find yourself oddly comforted, as though the herbs really are pushing the cold back a little. Your chest feels lighter, your breath steadier. Perhaps the mind needs ritual more than the body needs proof. A soldier across from you begins telling a story of a camp in Germany where men stuffed lavender into their bedding, claiming it soothed dreams and kept lice away. Another scoffs, saying, "Lavender is for ladies' chambers, not soldiers' tents." The argument sparks laughter, and soon half the tent is debating which herb is strongest against the cold. It is not a scholarly debate. It is a chorus of tired men clinging to any shred of hope. But it feels just as important. You run your fingers through the straw beneath you, feeling the brittle stalks and the unexpected crunch of garlic skins mixed in. It is odd, almost comic, but also strangely reassuring. Even here, in the mud of war, men reach for plants, for the familiar wisdom of fields and kitchens. The same herbs their mothers tucked into cupboards now lie beneath their heads, fighting frost and fear. The smells grow stronger as the night wears on. The herbs mingle with smoke from the brazier, creating a haze that blurs your senses. You feel drowsy, lulled, not just by exhaustion, but by the faint suggestion that you are protected. Whether or not the herbs truly heal, they soothe the mind, and sometimes that is enough to keep the body alive. You close your eyes, inhaling the earthy tang. The cold still claws at your feet. Your cloak still itches, But your mind drifts easier. Perhaps you will wake with lice crawling, or perhaps the garlic will chase them off. Perhaps the sage smoke will ease your lungs, or perhaps it will only make you cough. You do not know, and you do not care. All that matters is that you feel a little safer, a little warmer, a little less alone. The herbal scent lingers faintly, but it does little to distract you from another inescapable reality of life in the tent. You scratch your arm, then your thigh, and realize the itching has returned with a vengeance. It is not the straw, it is not the wool. It is the living, crawling company that thrives where warmth and bodies press together. Lice, fleas, vermin, that love soldiers as much as the frost hates them. It is a plain, unvarnished truth of medieval life. Vermin were constant companions in military camps. Chronicles describe men scratching themselves raw, their rough garments crawling with lice, and the straw bedding alive with fleas. No one escaped it. Nobles and peasants alike carried the same biting burden, though some disguised it better with perfumes or frequent changes of linen, luxuries unavailable here. You feel it now, the endless, maddening tickle across your scalp, the phantom crawling sensation down your back. No amount of cloaks or furs can keep them entirely away. A soldier beside you mutters curses, tugging at his tunic and shaking it violently over the straw. Another digs furiously at his beard until flakes of skin scatter like tiny snowflakes. A third smacks his thigh with sudden triumph, having crushed some invisible parasite. The tent becomes a hive of scratching and low swearing, each man waging his private war against an enemy too small to see properly in the dim light. And here's a strange, darkly comic note from the records. Some soldiers swore that the vermin actually kept them warm. The grotesque idea was that lice and fleas fed on blood, but in return, their constant movement created a kind of heat against the skin. One chronicler mocked the claim, stating dryly it was a fire that burns only in torment. But you can imagine desperate men convincing themselves of anything. The notion is grotesque, yet you almost laugh. It is the ultimate irony, that suffering itself might be reframed as insulation. Scholars disagree on whether vermin outbreaks worsened in winter or summer. Some argue the layers of cloaks, furs, and unwashed bedding in cold months created the perfect breeding ground, trapping the creatures close to warm bodies. Others point out that the heat and filth in summer camps were just as bad, perhaps even worse for spreading disease. The debate has no firm answer, since lice leave little archaeological trace beyond second-hand anecdote. Still, the arguments rage in journals and books, while here in the tent, the proof scratches relentlessly at your skin. The smell of the tent seems heavier now, tinged with the musky odor of sweat-soaked wool that never truly dries, the sour tang of damp, decaying straw, and the faint metallic whiff of blood scratched raw from skin. You wrinkle your nose, but know there's no escaping it. Cleanliness is a luxury of bathhouses and monasteries, not siege lines and muddy fields. Someone mutters a story about a captain in Flanders who shaved his entire body head to toe to rid himself of lice. His men laughed until they saw him sleeping more peacefully than anyone else. Another claims boiling clothes in strong vinegar drove the pests away, though where vinegar would be found in such quantities out here remains a mystery. The tent erupts in debate, half practical advice, half crude mockery, as though the banter itself might kill the fleas. You shift again, tugging your cloak tighter, trying to ignore the persistent itch, but it gnaws at your sanity, more cruel in some ways than the frost. Cold makes you numb, but vermin keep you awake, relentlessly reminding you of your discomfort. You sigh, realizing that war has no mercy, no matter the scale. One moment you face arrows and steel. The next, you fight creatures smaller than a fingernail. Both can undo you in their own insidious ways. You scratch at your scalp again, flakes falling onto your cloak, and wonder grimly how many men have fallen sick, not from swords, but from the fevers spread by these tiny parasites. Typhus, trench fevers, nameless chills, diseases carried silently by the very things that crawl under your tunic right now. You shiver, and this time, not from cold. The irony, of course, is that lice thrive precisely because men huddle together for warmth. The very act that saves your life invites infestation. It is a cruel exchange. You live another night, but you live itchy, sore, and restless. Survival is rarely clean, rarely noble. You close your eyes, scratching less now, resigning yourself to their presence. Perhaps the soldier was right in some twisted way. The vermin are another kind of company, proof you are alive enough to feed them. You let the thought settle, bitter as it is, and drift towards sleep with the scratching still echoing in your ears. The scratching never really stops. It fades when exhaustion overtakes you, only to flare again when you inevitably roll over. Yet by now you've grown almost numb to it, the way a soldier grows numb to the constant weight of his sword belt. You shift in the straw, trying once more to ignore the itch, and your eye catches a flicker at the far end of the tent. A soldier has spread something bright across his bedding. You blink in disbelief. It is silk. That's one of those realities that never fails to sting. Armies looted not only food and straw, but also fine cloth. Tapestries stripped from manor walls, embroidered hangings ripped from churches, bolts of velvet stolen from merchants' carts, all found new life as insulation in tents. What once displayed wealth or holiness now sagged under mud and frost, pressed into service by men desperate for any scrap of warmth. Chroniclers frequently noted such thefts, half with disgust, half with a grudging awe at the ingenuity. You crawl closer and run your fingers over the edge of the fabric. Even in the dim light, you can tell it was once magnificent, dyed deep crimson, its threads glimmering faintly. Now it is smeared with dirt, its edges frayed and torn. The man lying on it grins at your obvious envy. Keeps the frost off better than straw, he boasts. You want to argue, to call him a lucky thief, but your hand lingers on the cloth. It is undeniably smoother than anything in your own meagre bedding, a startling taste of luxury amid profound misery. And here's a curious twist you remember hearing. There are tales of soldiers wrapping themselves in stolen altar cloths, the very fabric that once draped over sacred chalices. Imagine sleeping under the embroidered figure of a saint, not out of reverence, but because the thick gold thread holds heat. One chronicler even scolded troops for wiping their muddy boots on silk banners stolen from a cathedral. You can almost hear the scandalized gasp of the monks. But for soldiers facing a freezing night, warmth frequently outweighed sacrilege. Modern researchers disagree on just how widespread this practice of looting fine fabrics really was. Some argue that the colorful accounts were exaggerations, written by clergy to condemn armies for impiety. Others counter that inventories taken after campaigns often list tapestries and expensive cloth as spoils of war, proof they were taken in large quantities. Excavations of old campsites occasionally reveal shreds of fine dyed threads, though whether they came from grand hangings or simple garments is often unclear. The debate continues, caught forever between moral outrage and practical need. The tent fills with murmurs as men boast quietly about what they've stolen or scavenged. One says he sleeps on a tapestry that once showed angels, now half burned by sparks from a brazier. Another claims his cloak lining was cut from a noblewoman's gown, though no one believes him. The air hums with jealousy and rough laughter. You can almost forget the cold as men argue over whose stolen prize is warmest. The smell in the tent grows heavier with each breath. Smoke lingers from the brazier, mingling with wool, sweat, and now the faint mustiness of old cloth dragged from damp, abandoned houses. There's even a whiff of beeswax, perhaps still clinging to a church banner that once hung beside candles. It is a strange perfume, half sacred, half profane, reminding you that war has no respect for boundaries. You roll back to your place on the straw and close your eyes, picturing the tapestry as it once was, hanging proudly in a great hall, gleaming in torchlight, admired by noble eyes. Now it is crushed under the weight of soldiers, smothered in mud and breath. The transformation is jarring. But perhaps this is the true fate of all finery in war, to be repurposed, stripped of beauty, reduced to mere survival. One soldier nearby mutters that the saints will curse you for stealing their cloth. Another scoffs, saying, "Warmth is blessing enough." The tent erupts into another brief debate, half theological, half practical. You smile faintly, realizing that even amid the frost, men still find the energy to argue about heaven and hell. Maybe that too is a kind of warmth. The silk gleams faintly, as the brazier's glow catches it one last time, like a dying ember refusing to go dark. You curl tighter into your cloak, straw scratching your back, and wonder what it would feel like to lie on such softness, even just once. Then you sigh, reminding yourself that silk cannot keep a man alive by itself. It is still just cloth, still vulnerable to damp and frost. In the end, all that truly matters is waking when dawn comes. And so you turn away from the gleam, muttering a prayer that your coarse wool will be enough. Luxury may soften the night, but endurance is what carries you to morning. The gleam of stolen silk fades as you turn back into your own cocoon of damp wool. For a moment you close your eyes and try to surrender to sleep again, but a murmur of voices breaks the stillness. This isn't the rowdy chorus of song, nor the low cadence of prayer you heard earlier. This sound is softer, gentler, almost intimate. You realize the voices belong not just to soldiers. There are women here too, moving quietly between the tents, whispering, tending, and keeping a different kind of warmth alive. It's a part of army life less celebrated in the chronicles, but well known nonetheless. The presence of camp followers, women, whether wives, lovers, laundresses, cooks, or sometimes simply survivors, clinging to the army for protection, travelled with medieval hosts. They carried burdens, patched torn tents, mended cloaks, and sometimes even tended the precious fires through the long night. Without them, many armies would have frozen faster, starved sooner, and collapsed utterly under the relentless weight of the cold. You open your eyes wider and watch as one woman stoops low to adjust the tent flap, carefully tucking straw into the gap to block the insidious draught. Another sets down a small pot near the dying brazier, its thin steam carrying the faint, welcome smell of broth. The men inside stir, some murmuring a rough thanks, others too exhausted to do more than grunt their acknowledgement. You feel the air grow a little warmer, not because the pot holds much heat, but simply because someone cares enough to stir it. And then comes one of those curious details whispered in soldiers' stories. Some women slept alongside soldiers, not just for companionship, but explicitly to share body heat. It was a practical arrangement, as much as an emotional one. A warm body pressed beside you could mean the difference between waking stiff or simply not waking at all. Chroniclers, often monks, sometimes sneered at this, calling it immorality. But you can hear the truth in the soft sighs of men curling closer under their cloaks. In the frost, virtue is a luxury. Warmth is a necessity. Historians still disagree about the numbers involved. Some suggest only small groups of women accompanied armies, tolerated grudgingly at the margins of the camp. Others point to compelling evidence that whole communities, wives, children, even elderly kin, moved with military forces across Europe, creating a shadow society perpetually behind the lines. Excavations of camp remains often reveal domestic items. Spindles for thread, fragments of children's toys, items that hint the army's footprint was far wider than just swords and shields alone. The reality was likely a shifting balance, swelling and shrinking with each campaign. You lie back, listening to the faint sounds filtering through the canvas, the scrape of a spoon against an iron pot, the soft murmur of a lullaby hummed by a woman to a child, tucked somewhere in the corner of a nearby tent. The air smells faintly sweeter now, as if the herbs from earlier have mixed with the simple broth, masking the ever-present rankness for a while. You breathe deeply, grateful. War is misery, but this quiet presence softens its harshest edges. A soldier nearby cracks a joke, his voice rough but clear. The women are braver than the men, for they face the same cold without armor or weapons. Laughter follows, but it is respectful laughter, tinged with an undeniable truth. You imagine the sheer courage it takes to march with an army, to face frost, hunger, and constant danger without the promise of pay or formal protection. You feel a flicker of admiration in your chest, warming you better than the fading brazier. Another man tells a story of a laundress who saved her husband by pulling him back from a frozen ditch after a long march. He had collapsed, half dead, but her frantic shouting roused comrades to drag him back to camp. Without her, he would have been just another body found stiff with frost come morning. You picture her stubborn face, her determination, refusing to let winter win. Such stories rarely make it into the official chronicles, written by men about men's battles. But here in the tents, they live on, passed like vital charms against despair. The scholars still argue, were these women tolerated reluctantly or embraced as vital components of the army? Some claim commanders despised their presence, fearing distraction and disorder. Others note that official records sometimes list rations allocated specifically to them, proof they were recognized, even counted as part of the host. The disagreement lingers in academic texts, but in this moment, you don't need parchment evidence. You can hear them right here, stirring pots, patching cloaks, humming softly. Their essential survival work is woven into the fabric of the night as tightly as any wool cloak. The cold still bites, but it feels less monstrous when you know someone might adjust the flap to keep the worst of the wind out. You curl tighter into your cloak, your cheek pressed against the rough straw, and let the murmurs wash over you. For a fleeting moment, you can almost believe you are back home, listening to familiar voices in the next room, safe under a solid roof rather than flimsy canvas. That fragile illusion eases the ache in your bones more effectively than any stolen fur. Sleep comes easier with that simple comfort in your ears. You breathe slowly, letting the faint smells of broth and herbs mix with the underlying musk of the tent. The frost outside may still sharpen its teeth, but inside, for a little while, warmth is shared not only by body heat and dying braziers, but by hands that mend, voices that soothe, and the simple, stubborn presence of women who refuse to stay behind. The murmurs of the women eventually fade, as exhaustion finally overtakes the tent again. You roll onto your back, staring up at the faint frost crystals spidering delicately across the canvas above you. In the dim glow of the last embers, the uneven snoring of your companions seems almost rhythmic, a rough baseline to the night. Yet one sound cuts through it, the grumble of a knight, muffled but distinct, drifting from the larger pavilion nearby. His voice carries authority even in complaint, and it draws bitter chuckles from the men huddled around you. It is a well-attested reality in the sources. The voices of rank told a different story of the cold. Knights and noble officers had larger tents, thick rugs, servants, and richer bedding, yet they still complained loudly and frequently about their hardships. Meanwhile, peasants and foot soldiers, packed together like salted fish, endured with far fewer words, their silence born of grim necessity. Chroniclers themselves often recorded the grievances of lords, for those were the voices deemed worth writing down, while the common man's weary mutters rarely reached parchment. But here, in the cramped dark, you hear both sides. The knight curses his stiff joints, declaring loudly that the damp has ruined his expensive armor straps. A soldier beside you snorts derisively, muttering that he would gladly trade frostbitten toes for merely ruined straps. Another says mockingly, "Hark! The lords freeze differently than us." The laughter is low, muffled under cloaks, but it spreads quickly through the tent. Humor is rebellion, and in the cold, rebellion helps keep you warm. And there's a curious detail you can't help but notice, echoed in some accounts. Even knights, for all their privilege, sometimes admitted a grudging envy of their men. Chronicles hint that nobles, cocooned alone in their vast, draughty pavilions, sometimes froze more than the huddled masses. The common soldier's misery was shared, and with that sharing came communal warmth. A knight wrapped in fur on a feather bed might look enviable, but when the fire died down and the canvas shook violently in the wind, loneliness proved a colder companion than rough straw shared with others. Scholars continue to debate the true gulf between noble and peasant comfort in camp. Some argue the disparity was extreme, that commanders lived almost luxuriously compared to their men. Others caution that the differences, while undeniably real, have likely been exaggerated by later storytellers eager to paint nobles as decadent and selfish. The truth probably shifted significantly with time and place. A powerful duke campaigning in Burgundy might indeed sleep on silk cushions, while a minor knight on the Scottish border froze much the same as his men. The evidence is scattered, inconsistent, and so the arguments linger. The smells differ too, telling their own story. From the noble pavilion comes the faint whiff of burning resin and spiced wine drifting on the draught. In your tent, it is smoke, sweat, and garlic-stuffed straw. You wrinkle your nose, but smile faintly. Scents tell the story of class as much as banners or coats of arms. One of your companions whispers that he once saw a baron bring a portable brazier intricately carved with silver, glowing like a hearth fit for a king. Another replies immediately with a tale of a knight who demanded his heated stones be wrapped in velvet, only for them to burn holes straight through the precious cloth. The laughter that follows is sharp and deeply satisfied. The more ridiculous the noble complaints, the more warmth the common men seem to find in mocking them. You shift under your cloak, pressing closer to the soldier at your side, and wonder how much truth lies in these muttered stories. Perhaps exaggeration simply fuels necessary resentment. Perhaps the truth is simpler, that every man, noble or peasant, groans under the relentless frost in his own way. Still, the complaints of knights sting more because they are heard more. To lie freezing in straw and overhear your lord bemoaning damp boots is insult piled atop misery. The tent grows quiet again, though now and then a muttered joke flares up like sparks from a dying fire. You close your eyes, still tasting the bitterness of class division in the air. Survival may bind all soldiers together against the cold, but comfort clearly divides them, and envy sharpens the senses even as the frost numbs the limbs. And yet, there is a strange, humbling truth you cannot ignore. When dawn eventually comes, knight and peasant alike will rise stiffly, scrape ice from their cloaks, and prepare to march side by side. Rank may divide comforts, but it does not spare anyone entirely from the frost. The cold is mercilessly democratic. With that thought, you tug your cloak tighter and let sleep claim you again. Your last awareness is the stark contrast between those muffled, noble complaints and the rough, enduring silence of men who simply endure. You wake to a strange noise. Not coughing, not muttering, not even the wind whining through the seams of the canvas. It's chewing, soft, steady, almost desperate. You turn your head and just catch the shape of a soldier crouched low, gnawing on something by the dim glow of the last embers. At first, you think it's bread, but then you see the faint glint of metal he's scraping a bit of dried meat from his dagger blade. The smell of grease drifts faintly across the straw, and your stomach tightens with sharp envy. Food. Always food. It is written plainly across every record of winter campaigning. The cold could perhaps be endured if bellies were filled, but hunger made the frost unbearable, lethal. Armies that ran short on rations saw morale collapse instantly, desertion spike dramatically, and illness spread faster than any enemy arrow. It was not just fire and furs that kept men alive through the night, but the precious, internal heat generated by food in their bellies. You roll onto your side and think bitterly of your last meal. Thin gruel, half frozen by the time it reached the bowl. It warmed your throat for a fleeting minute before leaving you feeling hungrier than before. The man chewing now clearly has something richer. Hard sausage, perhaps, or fat rendered down into a solid lump. You can almost taste it. The salt, the faint tang of smoke. And here comes one of those peculiar details passed down in soldiers' whispers. Men sometimes slipped hot stones into their cooking pots, both to heat the thin gruel faster and, strangely, to stretch it. Stones boiled with scraps of meat would supposedly release minerals and make the thin liquid seem thicker. Whether it truly nourished them is doubtful, but the illusion of a fuller meal might have made it easier to close one's eyes against the gnawing cold. You smile grimly at the image. Dozens of men hunched over bowls filled half with watery soup, half with smooth river pebbles. Historians continue to debate how much actual nutrition soldiers received during protracted sieges and winter marches. Some insist supplies were carefully managed, citing detailed records of grain and salted pork distributed in strict quotas. Others argue forcefully that corruption, theft, and sheer logistical chaos left common men starving more often than not. Archaeology shows evidence supporting both sides. Animal bones gnawed down to splinters found in some camps, and discarded, spoiled heaps of grain in others. The truth, as ever, seems uneven, inconsistent. But here in your tent, the academic debate doesn't matter. The proof is in your belly, which growls loudly enough to make the men nearby chuckle softly in the dark. One tosses you a crust of bread so hard it could genuinely be mistaken for a stone. You gnaw at it anyway, grateful for the faint crunch and the salty aftertaste. Hunger makes even misery taste good. The smells within the tent shift subtly as more men pull out their hidden scraps: dried peas, strips of pork fat, chunks of onions smuggled from a recently passed village. The mingled scents fill the air, sour but somehow comforting, masking the usual stink of wool and damp. For just a moment, the tent feels less like a tomb and more like a rough kitchen. One soldier mutters a story about a campaign in the Baltic where men roasted rats over a brazier, insisting the greasy meat kept them warmer than any cloak. Another claims he once ate boiled horsehide, softened over hours until it resembled a kind of leather soup. The tent erupts in groans and uneasy laughter. Yet beneath the grim jokes lies an undeniable truth. Hunger drove men to consume almost anything. You lick the last crumbs from your fingers and realize how profoundly food shapes survival. A full belly means a better chance at sleep, even on damp, prickly straw. Hunger feels worse than the frost itself, rattling you awake in endless, uncontrollable shivers. A soldier who eats, however poorly, has a chance at dreams. A starving one simply stares at the canvas ceiling all night, listening to his bones creak in the cold. The debate among scholars echoes faintly in your thoughts again. Was food truly enough to fight the cold, metabolically speaking, or was it only a short psychological reprieve? Some point to the incredibly high-calorie needs of marching and fighting in winter, claiming issued rations could never realistically keep up. Others argue that preserved meat, hard cheese, and grain, when supplies actually held out, gave medieval armies surprising resilience against the elements. No single conclusion satisfies. But as you scrape the last invisible crumb from your cloak, you know one thing for certain. Tonight, your body is profoundly grateful for even this hard, stale crust. The tent falls quieter as men finish chewing, their bellies filled, even if barely. Sighs begin to replace the earlier groans. You close your eyes, feeling the faint warmth spread slowly from your stomach out towards your limbs. It is not much, but it is enough to coax drowsiness. You think of home, of thick stews bubbling over hearths, of bread fresh and warm from the oven, of meat cooked until the juices ran freely. Then you open your eyes to the dim, smoky air of the tent and remind yourself sharply: war offers no feast, only survival. You curl back into your cloak, straw rustling beneath you, boots stiff against your shins, and let the small comfort of food, meager though it is, carry you toward uneasy sleep. Your belly holds just enough food to take the sharpest edge off the cold, but deep sleep still won't come easy. The tent feels damp, the air heavy with moisture, and every draught cuts sharper than the last. You curl tighter, trying to tuck your knees under your chin, seeking that perfect position, but it is never enough. The body is stubborn when warmth fades completely. No position feels right for long. You shift onto your side, then your back, then your stomach, only to find each new angle somehow worse than the last. It's one of those mundane miseries, rarely glorified in the chronicles, but certainly admitted between the lines. Soldiers spent much of the night simply tossing, adjusting, never quite finding true rest. The cold made the body its own enemy. Muscles cramped relentlessly, joints stiffened like old hinges, and sleep, when it arrived at all, came in broken, unsatisfying fragments rather than long, restorative stretches. Some surviving letters from the period even note that exhaustion on the battlefield was often as much from poor nights as from hard marching by day. You glance around the tent and see others faring no better. One man snores fitfully, jerking awake periodically as though startled by a bad dream. Another sits bolt upright, cloak wrapped tightly around him, muttering that lying down only makes him colder. A third has pressed himself desperately against the tent wall, his breath freezing the canvas in tiny, intricate patterns of ice. Each man here fights his own lonely, losing battle against profound discomfort. And then you remember one of those odd habits soldiers sometimes resorted to: sleeping in strange, curled positions deliberately copied from animals. Some huddled like dogs, knees drawn tightly under their chests, arms wrapped around themselves. Others lay face down, cloaks pulled completely over their heads, transforming themselves into anonymous lumps of cloth in the darkness. Chroniclers occasionally mocked them for sleeping like beasts, but imitation often meant survival. If a dog knew instinctively how to conserve warmth, why shouldn't a man learn from it? Scholars remain divided on how conscious these positions truly were. Some argue they were purely instinctive, the body curling naturally against the pervasive frost. Others suggest soldiers deliberately adopted them, perhaps even teaching one another which shapes trapped the most body heat. The absence of detailed descriptions in historical sources makes certainty elusive, but the basic logic is undeniable. Every limb tucked in meant less precious heat lost to the unforgiving night air. You roll onto your side again, curling yourself even tighter, chin tucked hard against your chest. The posture feels strange, unnatural, but slowly, faintly, you feel warmth begin to gather around your torso. Your legs still ache, your toes still feel like ice. But the violent shivering slows, just a little. You breathe shallowly, afraid that deep breaths will release what little heat you've managed to hoard. The tent groans again in the wind, and the straw beneath you crunches loudly with every tiny shift. The smell of damp earth seeps up through it, mingling inescapably with wool and smoke. It is a heavy, oppressive scent, but strangely grounding. You imagine roots buried deep in the frozen soil outside, surviving winter storms, and you take a small comfort in the thought that you, too, might endure the night, rooted stubbornly in this profound discomfort. A soldier nearby whispers advice into the darkness. Keep your arms tight, don't stretch them out. Cold steals faster from open limbs. Another replies, his voice thick with sleep. I'll trade your advice for your cloak. The brief exchange sparks muffled laughter, tired but real. Even small jokes like these ease the endless, frustrating shifting. You shut your eyes again, trying to let the simple rhythm of your breathing guide you towards rest. Inhale, exhale, cloak pressed tight to your face. Boots locked hard against the straw. The body resists, aches, complains, but the mind coaxes. Stillness, stillness, stillness. Sleep doesn't come as a wave tonight, but as a slow drip, gathering gradually until it finally weighs your eyelids down. Yet the night is never truly merciful. A sudden draft slips in, brushing your neck like the cold edge of a knife. You jerk fully awake, cursing silently, and pull the cloak even tighter, if possible. The shivers return instantly, viciously, undoing the small progress of the last few minutes. You groan aloud this time, realizing this is the inescapable pattern. Half an hour of shallow dozing, followed by half an hour of shivering, repeated endlessly until dawn. The historians may write about the great battles, about fluttering banners, about noble speeches on horseback, but here in the freezing tent, the truth is much plainer, much harsher. War is not just fought with swords and arrows. It is fought with every awkward position you can twist your aching body into, every scrap of warmth you can possibly hoard, every breath you try consciously not to waste. The struggle is not only against external enemies, but against your own restless, freezing bones. You lie still once more, body curled tight like a hound against the cold, listening to the chorus of other restless sleepers. The snoring, the coughing, the muttered curses, they weave together into a kind of crude lullaby, rough but steady. You let yourself drift with it, not towards deep, peaceful rest, but towards something closer to sheer survival. And in this world, perhaps survival is sleep enough. You jolt awake, though you cannot tell why at first. The camp is hushed. The only sounds are the restless shifting of men and the low groan of canvas in the wind. Then you realize what stirred you. The air. It feels heavier, warmer, somehow thicker with the presence of so many bodies pressed close together. You draw in a breath, and it tastes damp, sour with sweat and smoke, but undeniably there is warmth in it nonetheless. It was a common tactic, though not one proudly sung of in poems. Soldiers huddled together, using their own bodies as fuel against the biting cold. No single cloak or fur, however thick, could do what sheer human heat could achieve when multiplied. A dozen men pressed side by side under shared blankets or piled cloaks could hold off a frost that would surely kill them if they faced it alone. Chroniclers rarely lingered on this crude reality, but the truth seeps through in scattered, often dismissive, notes about companies lying like swine or sharing skins simply to endure the night. You feel the undeniable truth of it now as you shift closer to the man beside you, your knees knocking against his, your shoulders touching. At first it feels awkward, invasive. You are warriors, perhaps strangers, not kin sharing a hearth. But the warmth seeps between you quickly, undeniably welcome. Soon another man presses in on your other side, and before long the tent becomes a dense knot of bodies, tangled cloaks, and the steady, rhythmic sound of shared breathing. It is far from comfortable, but it is raw survival. And here's a curious wrinkle you recall from old stories. Some soldiers joked that the worst part of huddling wasn't the uncomfortable closeness itself, but the morning after, when cloaks were stiff with the frozen sweat, where bodies had steamed together all night. Imagine peeling apart layers of men and stiffened cloth like thawing meat, each soldier groaning as they separated from the collective mass. Disgusting, yes, but life rarely tastes sweet on the battlefield. Scholars remain uncertain how universal this practice actually was. Some argue it must have been routine. Basic physics demanded it for survival in harsh conditions. Others point out that powerful cultural norms of modesty and masculinity may have made men resist such close contact, at least in some armies or regions. Still, archaeological evidence of wide communal shelters and large shared bedding pits hints strongly that many soldiers did indeed share heat this way. The written record may be sparse on the details, but the practical logic is too strong to easily deny. You let your head rest against the shoulder of the man beside you. His hair is greasy, his breath foul, yet the warmth radiating from him is undeniable. You close your eyes and for a fleeting moment imagine you are back in your village, curled beside family on a long winter's night. The illusion is fragile, easily shattered, but it soothes you nonetheless. In the deep dark, the gnawing cold somehow matters less than the simple, steady rhythm of another chest rising and falling beside your own. The smell of so many bodies packed tightly together becomes overwhelming. Wool damp with sweat, leather stiff with old grease, smoke clinging stubbornly to every fold of fabric. It is pungent, sour, almost unbearable to a modern sensibility. Yet you realize that in its own strange way, it is the smell of life. These potent odors are visceral proof that blood still flows, hearts still beat, warmth still radiates from living flesh. In this harsh context, the stench itself becomes a form of reassurance. One soldier mutters a rough joke about pigs in a pen, and the tent erupts with soft, weary chuckles. Another grumbles about being kicked hard in the shins by a restless comrade nearby. A third sighs with something close to contentment, declaring he hasn't felt this warm since he left home months ago. Humor, complaint, and simple relief mingle together in the darkness, weaving a rough thread of camaraderie through the long night. You listen as the laughter fades, replaced by the slow, uneven chorus of snores. The warmth generated by the mass of bodies grows almost stifling, and you dare to loosen your cloak slightly, a luxury utterly unthinkable just hours earlier. You marvel at the strange paradox. The very closeness that makes you itch, gag, and fume is the fundamental thing keeping you alive. The scholarly debate lingers faintly in your thoughts. Was this huddling purely pragmatic, a simple matter of thermal dynamics? Or did it inadvertently deepen the bonds among soldiers, forging connections through shared misery? Some historians argue that shared hardship forged a comradeship stronger than any formal oaths. Others warn against romanticizing the situation, reminding that resentment, theft, and simmering violence often thrived in such intensely close, deprived quarters. The truth likely contains elements of both. You feel the constant press of elbows and knees, the unwelcome grumble of a man's breath against the back of your neck, and you know intimately that it is both profound comfort and profound annoyance, all at once. You shift again, feeling the straw crunch loudly beneath your weight, and realize the collective warmth is steady now, less fragile than it felt before. The cold still nips sharply at your exposed nose and frozen toes, but the core of your body is finally wrapped in a layer of shared heat. For the first time in what feels like many nights, you do not shiver uncontrollably. You sigh, sinking deeper into this crude, almost animal embrace of survival. And as you drift towards a less fractured sleep, you cannot help but reflect. Armies may march under proud banners, fight fiercely for kings, pray devotedly to saints, but in the end, raw survival is simpler, more fundamental than all of that. It is bodies pressed together in the dark, hearts beating stubbornly against the encroaching frost, men becoming living blankets for one another. It is not glorious, not noble, certainly not clean, but it works. And in this brutal world, that is truly all that matters. You stir again, though this time not from cold or itching or hunger, but from a sound that makes your whole body tense instantly, the sudden, sharp blast of a horn echoing from outside. It is not the morning call. The sky is still utterly dark, the tent still frozen with the deepest part of the night. Men around you jolt upright, instinctively fumbling for cloaks and blades in the disorienting darkness. For one terrifying moment, you imagine raiders, enemy scouts slipping silently into the sleeping camp. Then, after a tense pause, you hear the familiar, barking bark of an officer's voice. Not alarm, but routine. It is simply the night watch calling the change of guard. The sound reminds you of another harsh truth of these camps. Men did not always sleep undisturbed through the night. Guard rotations meant some unfortunate souls had to stay awake, pacing the frozen perimeter, stamping their feet relentlessly to keep blood flowing, keeping weary eyes sharp for any sign of ambush. Inside the tents, men half slept, perpetually alert for horns or sudden shouts, knowing the night was never wholly safe. The cold was enemy enough, but the gnawing fear of surprise attack meant that true rest was fragile at best, often non-existent. You slump back into your straw, heart still hammering against your ribs. Around you, others grumble, cursing the officer for bellowing so loudly in the dead of night. But one man simply shrugs and mutters, "Better noise than knives at our throats." He is right. You sigh, trying to settle again, though sleep now feels impossibly far away. And here's one of those odd, almost comical practices whispered about. Some soldiers allegedly took turns lying awake inside the tent, tasked with keeping the brazier alive or, more grimly, nudging others forcefully if they stopped breathing evenly. A crude kind of internal night watch within the fragile shelter itself. Imagine trying to sleep while your comrade stares intently at you in the dark, waiting to prod you back to life if you merely stopped snoring for too long. Unsettling, certainly, but potentially effective when the frost killed silently, insidiously. Scholars still disagree over how much real sleep soldiers truly got on campaign. Some argue men simply collapsed into near-comatose states from sheer, bone-deep exhaustion, capable of sleeping through almost anything. Others insist that numerous accounts of constant vigilance of men waking often to stoke fires, adjust cloaks, or check on comrades are closer to the lived truth. Archaeology can't resolve this particular debate. Sleep leaves no bones, no durable artifacts. Only scraps of writing remain, and they rarely dwell on the quality of snoring. Yet lying here, startled fully awake by distant horns, you know that rest was rarely whole, rarely deep. The acrid smell of smoke drifts into the tent again, harsher now as the guards outside stoke their perimeter fires against the encroaching dark. It mixes with the familiar musk of wool and sweat until your throat stings. You cough, earning immediate, muffled curses from the men beside you. Sleep broken repeatedly by noise, discomfort, and irritation. This, you realize, is the true rhythm of camp nights. One soldier grumbles about an ambush years ago when men were caught half asleep, armor scattered uselessly, tents suddenly ablaze. His voice trembles slightly with the lingering memory. Another retorts sharply that freezing to death in silence would surely be worse. The debate flares briefly, fueled by nervous energy, but exhaustion douses it quickly. Soon the tent settles back into muttering, then fitful dozing again, though now with one ear instinctively cocked for the next horn call. You pull your cloak tighter, your hand resting near the dagger still tucked at your side, and realize how much raw fear shapes the night. The frost claws relentlessly at your skin, true, but it is the persistent thought of sudden, violent attack that keeps your mind perpetually restless. Even the huddle's warmth cannot fully shield you when survival depends just as much on vigilance as on insulation. The historians who meticulously debate logistics, rations, or tent construction often overlook this crucial element. The silent, internal mental war fought constantly in the dark. Men slept, yes, but always with the heavy weight of watchfulness pressing down on them. No rest was ever truly unbroken, no dream entirely undisturbed, even in the depths of exhaustion. You feel it now. You half expect to rise instantly at any sudden shout, ready to grab a weapon before you've even shaken the sleep completely from your eyes. You roll onto your side again, boots pressing hard into the straw, listening intently as the horn sounds once more in the far distance. Another guard shift, nothing more. The camp breathes unevenly around you. 1,000 men snoring, coughing, muttering prayers or curses in fractured, restless unison. You close your eyes, forcing a fragile calm, telling yourself the night will pass without the flash of blades. And so you surrender once more to that peculiar half-sleep unique to soldiers, shallow, fractured, easily broken, but perhaps enough. Enough to survive, if not truly to dream. Enough to endure until the first pale line of dawn finally slices across the eastern horizon. The horn call fades into memory, and for a while, you lose yourself again in the shallow, fractured rhythm of soldiers' sleep. But when you next stir, it isn't the sound of guards or the sharp bite of a draft that wakes you. It's a glow. Not fire, not the dying embers of the brazier, but the faintest grey shimmer pressing insistently against the canvas walls. Dawn. You sit up slowly, agonizingly. Every joint is stiff, protesting. Straw clings stubbornly to your cloak. Around you, men groan awake one by one, a chorus of misery. Some rub frost vigorously from their beards. Others stamp their booted feet heavily on the packed earth floor, trying desperately to force feeling back into numb toes. The air inside the tent is sharp, heavy with stale smoke and sour breath, but the air outside, you know, will be sharper still. You push the flap aside, and the world greets you with the cold, hard glint of steel. The entire field is coated in white frost. Tents sag under its weight, ropes stiff as iron rods. Horses tied nearby steam faintly in the pale, weak light, their breath pluming like smoke. And here lies the blunt, unavoidable truth. Surviving the night is only half the battle. The morning after presents its own brutal ordeal. Men rose groggy, half frozen, aching in every limb, and were expected to immediately march, fight, or dig trenches, as if the long, cold night had not gnawed relentlessly at their strength. Chroniclers often note dawn scenes like this. Armies staggering into formation, with eyes still rimmed red with cold and lack of sleep, faces etched with exhaustion. You feel it in your own bones now. This is how victory truly begins. Not with inspiring courage or grand pronouncements, but with the simple, stubborn, painful act of standing up when every fibre of your being screams to lie down. You stamp your boots hard into the thin crust of snow covering the mud. The shock jolts through your legs, painful but necessary to wake them. Around you, the same ritual repeats endlessly across the waking camp, cursing, stamping, shaking out stiff cloaks, brushing frost futilely from frozen canvas. These are the morning hymns of a winter camp, sung not with melody, but with groans and muttered oaths. And here's one of those peculiar details passed along in half-forgotten letters. Some men deliberately rubbed handfuls of snow on their faces at dawn, claiming it woke the blood better than any fire could. You imagine the intense sting, the burn of frozen crystals against already raw, wind-chapped skin. Yet, in a strange way, you understand it. It shocks you awake, forces breath back into your chest. Pain as an alarm clock, frost as reveille. Specialists continue to argue about just how functional soldiers really were after nights like these. Some argue that profound fatigue crippled armies, making morning marches disastrously slow and clumsy, vulnerable to attack. Others point out that sheer necessity drove men forward regardless, that soldiers either hardened quickly to the conditions or died early. Surviving diaries and chronicles offer evidence for both pictures. Descriptions of units collapsing in utter exhaustion, side by side, with accounts of men trudging onward for days, as if seemingly immune to the suffering. The truth, perhaps, is that every man balanced precariously on that thin line between breaking and enduring. The smell of morning is no kinder than that of the night. Thick smoke from rekindled fires mixes with the stench of horse manure, damp wool, and stale, sour wine. Yet, amidst the foulness, there is also a faint promise. The scent of thin porridge bubbling hesitantly in scores of iron pots, the welcome hiss of water poured onto dying coals to coax them back to life. Thin fare, certainly, but hot, and therefore golden in this frozen landscape. The men stir more eagerly at that simple smell than at any blaring horn. You step fully outside the tent and see the camp revealed in the pale dawn light. Long lines of tents rimed white with frost. Men crouched low over struggling fires, hands outstretched. Women ladling thin broth into wooden bowls. Horses stamping their hooves impatiently, their breath hanging thick in the air. It is a picture both profoundly pitiful and fiercely defiant against the vast, indifferent winter sky. Every figure seems small, fragile, almost absurd against the frozen backdrop. And yet, every single figure still breathes, still moves, still refuses to fall. That is the true victory, you think. Not banners captured or speeches made, but this stubborn, collective refusal to die in the night. A comrade claps you roughly on the shoulder, his hand coarse through your cloak, his smile weary but undeniably real. "Another night done," he says simply. The plain words carry more weight than any sermon. Another night done. Another night somehow survived. You look back at the sagging shape of your tent, stinking, patched, scratched white with frost. You remember the endless hours spent inside, straw itching relentlessly, boots bruising your feet, cloaks scratching your chin raw, vermin biting unseen, your very breath freezing against your face. You remember the small comforts, braziers glowing like captured stars, stones cooling slowly in your hands, rough songs rising against the dark, quiet prayers muttered into wool, laughter shared like precious wine, envy simmering at others' small luxuries, warmth borrowed desperately from beasts and from each other. You remember how many times, during the long darkness, you thought you could not possibly last until dawn, and yet you did. This, you realize with sudden clarity, this was the true essence of medieval war, as much as flashing swords and dramatic sieges. A long, grinding, unglamorous battle fought night after night against the cold, against the dark, against exhaustion itself. Chroniclers may have written eloquently of valor on the field of battle, but the truest, hardest test of endurance was fought right here, in the freezing dark, in the miserable cold, armed with nothing but flimsy canvas, damp straw, and stubborn human will. And as the pale sun finally climbs above the horizon, its weak light washing the frost-covered field in shades of silver, you allow yourself to breathe just a little easier. Not because the day ahead promises to be kind, it certainly won't, but simply, profoundly, because you outlasted the night. Now, as the story settles around you, you can let the noise of the waking camp drift softly into the background. Picture the frost-rimmed canvas fading slowly from view, the weary groans of waking soldiers softening until they become little more than whispers carried away on the morning wind. You've walked with them through the long, cold night. You've felt the sharp prick of straw, the biting sting of frost, the maddening scratch of vermin, the fleeting warmth of stolen cloaks and dying braziers. You've witnessed how survival rarely looks noble, how it depends so heavily on rough humor, grounding superstition, essential companionship, and a profoundly stubborn will simply to see the morning light again. Allow that vivid imagery to blur now, slow and gentle, like smoke rising lazily from a distant campfire until it disappears completely into the vast grey sky. Imagine the soldiers settling into their morning march, their burdened shapes fading into the distance, while the empty tent behind you collapses into profound silence. The harsh night you endured alongside them now becomes just a memory, distant and ultimately harmless. Breathe slowly now, deeply, and picture your own space surrounding you quieter, infinitely safer, and far warmer than any medieval camp could ever be. Feel the harsh, biting air of the tent soften into the gentle, familiar calm of your own room. Let the memory of stinging frost melt entirely into the comforting weight of your blanket. Allow the restless, muttered complaints of freezing men transform into the steady, peaceful hush of your own breath. You don't need to stamp your feet to feel them, or huddle desperately for warmth. You don't need to fight for scraps of food or curse the unforgiving wind. All of that belongs to another time, another place, long, long gone from here. You can simply rest now, knowing you've walked briefly through their difficult world and safely left it behind. So close your eyes, let your body sink heavier into comfort, and allow the very last fragments of that cold imagery to dissolve completely. The soldiers fade away. The frost melts into nothingness. The lingering campfire smoke vanishes entirely, and you are left now with only quiet and profound rest, quiet and sleep.